Over the next couple of hours, we're going to take you all throughout the Holy Land and show you some of the most amazing places that Jesus went, or obviously had a big impact on. These are all places that are biblically significant or historically significant that point us towards the gospel. I know what some of you are thinking right now, and you're thinking that I'm going to waste your time. This isn't going to be significant for you. However, that can't be further from the truth. I guarantee you that some of you watching this video will have your lives changed forever. And I know that's a big promise, but it's true. When you go to Israel or when you experience Israel for the first time, it changes the way in which you read the Bible. Ask anyone that's been over there. When you start to look at things in a real way, it changes how you view the gospel and how you view these words that are on a page. They're no longer words on a page, but you access the memory of how you see these different places. That's my goal with this video, is to make the kingdom real for you. I know specifically in 2024, there's a lot of people that are not traveling to Israel, whether that be because of fear, because of everything that's happening there, or financial reasons or health reasons. There's a lot of things that could keep you away from the Holy Land. And so this is me giving you a free all access trip to the Holy Land, showing you all of these locations and explaining everything along the way. The first time I went to Israel was over 10 years ago, and since then I've gone several times, including hosting my own trips, which has been an amazing opportunity. Every single year, my wife Vanessa and I take a group, and we want you to come with us, but if you can't go, I hope this video suffices. My wife and I spent a lot of time and money making sure that you guys could experience this trip for absolutely free. So make sure you watch the whole video because I don't want you to miss anything along this journey. Anyway, it's time to start the tour. My name's Brandon, and my mission is to show you the evidence of the kingdom of God. So many Christians live their lives as if God doesn't exist. They say they believe in him, but they don't actually walk it out. I honestly believe exploring places like Israel is going to give us context around the Bible that we didn't have before. So buckle up and subscribe as we make the kingdom real to you. Alright, so we're starting our Israel series. Now, before we jump into different locations, artifacts, and important things about Israel as a nation, we have to understand a few things about traveling to Israel in the first place. So there's a couple of videos up front in this Israel series that we're going to be talking about foundations of how you understand things in Israel, such as archaeology, or how they do specific things, or different timelines and eras. But this video in particular, we're going to be talking about travel. What is the travel like to Israel? What can you expect as you're traveling to Israel? Of course, there's a plenty of different routes, airlines, different types of things that you can expect to see, but this is kind of a general overview of what you can expect, how long it takes, what kind of food you're going to eat, what the situation is actually going to be like, specifically how you get into Israel and what you need visa-wise, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to chat about all of that and our experience as we headed to Israel just a few weeks ago. All right, so one of the main things we want to show you guys is travel in general. So when you get to the airport, normally you're going to go to an international airport. So if you're on the East Coast, that means like Miami, Newark, sometimes JFK. There's some different areas there. But for us, we're going from Nashville to Newark, and then from there straight to Tel Aviv. So travel's not too bad normally. Normally you're looking at a 10-hour flight from the East Coast, and then however you get there in the first place. So for us, it's around a 16 to 18-hour day, which is always fun. But you ready for this?
I'm so ready.
So this is truly the start of our trip, and we'll kind of go through each piece of it, what the plane looks like, what the travel is like, and then we'll talk about food, different stuff like that, in case you're worried about any of that, and we'll kind of walk through it piece by piece. So here we go. So first steps first is a pretty boring flight from Nashville all the way to Newark. But then when we land in Newark, we have to traverse this massive airport, finding our way around to a different concourse, and then finding our gate to go to Tel Aviv. Now this is an interesting thing. This is actually something I've never really seen before in an airport, and here, let me explain. This right here was our gate to actually go to Tel Aviv and board our plane. I've never personally seen this done at a gate before, where they recheck all your bags, they do an additional security scan, and then you're not allowed to leave this area. But this is what happened to us. But of course, it makes perfect sense with everything going on in Israel that they would want to have extra security, especially having several different nationalities and people groups on this flight that could quarrel with each other. But none of that happened for us.
I think they're being more secure than usual. Rightfully so.
All right, so now we're on the plane. Basically, we have a 10-hour flight from Newark to Tel Aviv. So it's a long flight. Hopefully, we're going to be able to sleep for most of the time.
For this trip, we get 2 meals. So right now it's the dinner. It's chicken, cilantro, and rice, and some sort of lentils, I think, and bread, and like a dessert. So this is what we get for at least dinner, and then breakfast is the second meal.
And obviously, this being an Israeli flight, there's obviously kosher options as well. So as you travel, you obviously have the normal things like movies and different things that you can do along the flight, but it is a long, long flight.
So last night was rough. I didn't get much sleep at all. I watched the Book of Eli. That was cool. Anyway, but now it's breakfast time, and we have eggs. The choices were eggs or waffles. And we've got eggs, croissant, some fruit. I don't even know what fruit is anymore. A little over an hour left on the trip. So we're almost there. Maybe, hopefully, I'll get a nap when we get the car.
So finally, after our 18-hour travel day, we finally landed in Tel Aviv safely. Now it was time to get through customs, the airport, and get to our rental car.
We made it.
So we just made it. I love this airport. It's one of the most beautiful airports. So I just wanted to let you guys know what basically happens when you get off the plane. Now that we're off the plane, you basically walk down this long corridor down here. Then you have to go to these machines over here, which everybody's at right now. And basically what happens is you get essentially a visa to enter into the country for tourism and different things. This will give you basically tax exemption for certain things, including hotels and stuff like that. But it's really important for, obviously, to get in and out of the country. So you got to keep that with you just as a reminder. But here's the airport. Now to go through customs. Here we go. Obviously, this is a new unwelcomed addition. A bunch of faces from hostages from the war coming in the airport. This is where you go down to customs right here after coming through and getting your little tag to go with your passport. Definitely an unsettling visage coming into the country for sure. Now I just wanted to play this all the way through. This is only a fraction of the faces that you're actually seeing that were taken in October. These are faces that are still gone, not knowing if they're dead or alive, and only a small portion of the hostages have been returned at all at this point. So many people are still waiting for the rest of the hostages to be returned, and a lot of people believe this is a futile wait, knowing that many of these people are most likely gone. So this is definitely a harrowing first look into Israel as you walk into the airport. If nothing else, definitely be praying for those people, for sure, as we go through this trip. To customs we go. All right, so right down this little ramp right here, obviously we can't film in the customs area, but you go there and you basically give them your passport and tell them why you're entering the country. If you've never traveled before, this can be a really intimidating part because they're really going to question you in where you're going to be or where you're going to stay, how many nights you're going to stay there. What they're trying to do is get any inconsistencies in your story to know if you're here to harm the country or if you're here for bad reasons. So they're not being rude just to be rude, it's just their job. They're trying to protect the country. So this is pretty crazy. So this is the baggage area in Israel. I've been here quite a few times when it's like, you know, not super busy, but this is like pretty crazy. I think our plane is the only one that's grabbing luggage right now, which is over there. And you can just see the rest of the place is just completely empty in terms of other planes that are coming in. Maybe 2 planes that are getting off right now, which is nuts. So if that tells us anything about who's going to be at these sites and different things, then in some ways it's great, in some ways it's sad, you know, not seeing tourism here, which is a huge product for Israel. So we'll see. Definitely crazy. And after grabbing our rental car, we headed off on the road and we began our journey into Israel. This was our travel portion. This took around 18 to 20 hours total to get into Israel and get set on our trip. So of course we were very, very tired at this point. This first day was incredibly difficult as we had gone nearly 26 hours without any sleep whatsoever. Generally when we take groups to Israel, I really like to land at nighttime so that we have one night to kind of recharge and recuperate from the flights, and then we get into our tour the next day. We may still be tired, but it's a lot more manageable. Welcome to the Israel series. We're going to be talking about so many different locations here in Israel, but before we get to those locations, I have to make this video first. We're going to be talking about different locations, time periods, and understanding really what is actually going on in Israel. It gets kind of confusing at some of these locations because you have things that are stacked up on each other from different time periods, different people, and different ages that kind of go throughout history. Old Testament, New Testament, and modern day. So there's a lot of different things that we have to talk about as we get into understanding Israel. But I will give you a little bit of a sneak peek of this theater right here from Caesarea Maritima. So first things first, let me show you our companion for this entire Israel series, and that is this topographical map of Israel. It's going to help us to navigate exactly where we are so that you can see this place as more than just a fantastical far-off location, but actually see exactly where these different locations are and see the different regions all throughout Israel. So let's talk about the three key areas we're going to focus on most during this Israel series, starting with this, the beautiful Sea of Galilee. This is one of the most prominent locations for Jesus' ministry, and it has so many first century locations that are going to be important for us to understand during our journey. Next, we'll move south to the Dead Sea area. There are a few really key locations here that span all the way back from the time of King David and beyond, all the way to the modern day, and understanding why this location is so important. Then our last location will be just to the west of the northern side of the Dead Sea, and this, of course, is the holy city itself, Jerusalem. Of course, this is the location where a lot of things happen with Jesus, including his death and resurrection, but there are so many amazing locations here in Jerusalem to discover, and we're going to talk about quite a few of them, especially around the Temple Mount. So every single episode, what we'll do is show you exactly where these things are on the map. We'll probably even pull up Google Maps as well to show you that this is a real place that really exists today. That's what the whole purpose of these videos are. Now, within these three locations, obviously many people have been all throughout the land of Israel for thousands and thousands of years. And throughout all of that time, there are different rulers that came in and out and controlled different parts of Israel throughout it. So we have to really simplify this in order to make it really easy for everybody to understand what's going on here. Some would say that these are split into 6 different time periods: the Canaanite period, the Israelite period, the Persian and Hellenistic period, the Roman and Byzantine period, the Islamic period, and then the modern period. However, this can get really complicated, and a lot of these time periods won't apply to what we're talking about in Israel during these videos. So let's simplify it a little bit. Most of what we're going to talk about in these videos and what I prioritize on our group trips to Israel are first century pieces of archaeology. These are towns or ruins or artifacts that have to do with directly the time of Jesus. Obviously, this is going to be the most important things that we're going to look at, and that's the majority of our videos here. So most of the time we will use this as a baseline in order to orient you in where we are in history. Then we'll talk about some things that I'll call the Old Testament-y stuff. This has to do with a lot of different characters and a lot of different eras of time, but as we get to those videos, I'll be more specific within those time periods. These are things before the New Testament that would have been in the Old Testament or referenced in the Old Testament. The next group that we see a lot of archaeology from is the early Christians. This includes the Byzantines, which is basically what was left over of the Roman Empire after Rome fell. And of course, other groups that became the early Christians from the apostles spreading the word, as well as Paul doing all of his travels. So there's a lot of different places here that we'll see from the early Christians as well. And sometimes these places get intermingled. This is one of the things that makes interpreting these different archaeological locations pretty difficult. If you don't understand which time periods these different things come from, you can get really confused because a lot of these time periods are stacked up on one another. And then the archaeologists may dig out a portion of the 3,000-year-old part, but then also dig out a portion of an early Christian church from 400 AD right next to it. And if that wasn't confusing enough, a lot of these national parks in different areas are trying to reconstruct these buildings that have fallen over from earthquakes or different things like that. And so on top of all of these different time periods, there's also restoration. And this is what I'm talking about right here. We're going to experience this all over Israel, not just here in Caesarea Maritima, where you have original steps here, which obviously are corroded over time. But then you have new construction that is made to basically make this space more functional or safer, depending on what area it's in. We'll have many more examples of this in the upcoming videos. You have to understand that most of these locations have been found in the last 100 years, and some of them in the last 20 years. So depending on who owns the land, this is a variable as well. For example, you might have a hotel right next to a first century synagogue, or you could have a whole nother building built directly on top of a very important archaeological find. Or in the best case scenario, in my opinion, you have places that are nearly untouched, places that are reconstructed so that people can come see them. However, they are mostly intact from where they were found. Then you have some of the hardest places to understand, which are the places that have had churches built on them over and over and over again for the last couple thousand years. And I totally understand that all of this information can get really overwhelming, and we're going to go over everything as we go through each episode of the series. Most of these episodes are going to be focusing on a specific area during a specific time, and so we're going to be talking about that every single episode. For example, our first episode next week is going to be at Caesarea Maritima. This is one of the only locations that is outside of these three locations that we just talked to you about. This is actually on the coast of Israel. Caesarea Maritima means Caesarea by the sea, and that's the Mediterranean Sea. So obviously this is a little bit of an outlier in terms of the main locations that we're focusing on. However, all of the same things apply here in terms of what era this is from. We're going to be focusing on the 1st century here. It was built before the 1st century, but it was in use during the time of Jesus and afterwards, which is what we're mostly going to be talking about in the next episode. This foundational video is one of the most important that we're going to make in this series because it's going to help you to understand where and when these different things happened. This is a key component in making the kingdom real to you. If I tell you, hey, I'm going to meet you down on Main Street, you have to know where that Main Street is in order to get there and see that it's an actual place, right? Israel is the same thing. If we read in the Bible that something happened at Caesarea, then we need to know where Caesarea is and which one it's talking about, Caesarea Philippi or Caesarea Maritima. And this plays into certain cultural names for things such as the other side of the Galilee or the Decapolis. Things like this we're going to go over throughout this series in order to help you understand where these locations are and what they actually were. So real quick, let's go back over the three locations and the three eras that we're going to be focusing on during this series. First is the Sea of Galilee. This is an amazing location with a ton of different stuff that's really important around it. Then Jerusalem, of course, the Holy City. This is a place that so much happened, and of course the center of all of the feast days for Judaism. Then the Dead Sea. While we don't see a ton of biblical moments here, there are some major historical things that we're going to find out over here, as well as some really cool biblical moments. Then to simplify the time periods in Israel, we are going to go with three different time periods. One being the Old Testament-y stuff. This is going to be stuff that happened during the Old Testament or more historical things that happened before Christ. Then we're going to focus around the 1st century. That's going to be a little bit before the 1st century and a little bit after, but this is the time of Jesus essentially. Then we're going to be focusing on the early Christians and some other historical groups right after the time of Christ that are really important archaeologically within Israel. So for every episode in this series, we'll remind you of the timeline and the area that we're in order for you to have a better idea of what we're looking at here. Now, yes, we are very much simplifying a lot of this information, including the time frames and different things like that, but that's the whole point of this series, is to make these things real to you guys and show you exactly what is going on at the base level. Last but not least, if you're interested in this map that we showed you earlier and you want to learn more about the three key areas in Israel, then you can go to our website, thesnipelife.com, and actually get this for yourself in a free printable file. Welcome to Caesarea Maritima, or in other words, Caesarea by the sea. Caesarea Maritima is the first location we're going to be breaking down in this Israel series. Now, of course, this is outside of the three main locations we talked about last time, and it's basically one of the only locations that is. Now, if we look right behind you, there's actually this huge coast right here on the side of Israel. This is the same coast that runs all the way down the Mediterranean. And of course, it's beautiful here. But this site right here is one of the most famous when it comes to ancient archaeological sites. And the reason for that is because it's just so impressive and so vast. There are a few key things that I really want you to understand when it comes to this city in particular. Let's start at the very beginning. How did Caesarea Maritima even get started? To put it on our timeline, this city was being built in 22 BC, but was active during the time of Jesus. And outside of the city itself, there are 5 main things that we look at when we come to Caesarea Maritima. Starting on the right-hand side of this image, we see the theater. Then moving to the left, we have the palace of Herod the Great. Then the hippodrome next to that. Then we see the port all the way to the left. Now, other than that, we have the actual city of Caesarea, where an event happened that changed the course of all of our lives completely. So stick around to the end of the video for me to tell you about that. As with many different locations throughout Israel, much of this city actually isn't excavated. As you can see, there's a parking lot right there in the back that probably covers tons of archaeological ruins, and even far beyond that, the city would have extended. So it's kind of hard to see everything that this city would have had to offer. This is a massive city. Not only is there this giant theater behind me, but also a massive port that could house hundreds of ships. Most of that port is now disintegrated into the sea, and a lot of this is ruins now, but you can see the basis for what was here previously. This was built by the master architect himself, Herod the Great. You'll often hear him referred to as the master builder of Israel, and that is for very good reason. He built so many of the amazing places that we're going to look at on this trip, and we'll point out every single one that he had a hand in. Now, while Herod was not a great guy, there's definitely some things that he showed us, like these buildings and these architecture pieces, that are really magnificent even to this day. You can tell even by the name Caesarea or Caesarea that this is named after Caesar, right? The emperor of Rome. Why is that if this is an Israeli territory? If this is a Jewish territory? Well, that's because after the Maccabees, of course, Rome took over, and then we have Herod, who was put in place by Caesar to be the client king in Israel. While Herod was a local, he definitely wasn't serving the Jewish people overall. He was really serving the Romans. And that's why he built this city, to thank Caesar for appointing him as king and giving him the power over this land here. Now, we're really lucky to be here when we are. Normally this place is packed out with several different groups that are in just the theater alone. But as you can see, this theater is completely empty.
This theater is one of the main attractions now, and of course would have been even back during the time of Jesus.
Actually, let's step a bit closer and talk about one of the most amazing events that could have taken place right here.
This magnificent piece of architecture is called the Theater of Caesarea. This is where all the entertainment would have taken place while the city was active. And in fact, this theater is so well preserved that they still use this for shows today. If you look close enough, you can actually see that each of these seats is numbered so that they can have your seat number on your ticket. However, during the time of Christ, while this was used for entertainment, it would also be used for other purposes such as large meetings.
And this location could be one of the most important locations for one of our favorite people in the scriptures, which is Paul. Paul was actually imprisoned here at Caesarea Maritima for at least 2 years. And during that time, he could have also written some of the epistles that we know and love today. That's incredible to me. And it really blows my mind to think about how he could have spent his time here in a prison trying to deal with all of these different things. Now, this location is the theater of Caesarea Maritima. Not only is it a place of entertainment, but it was also maybe a place of meeting as well. So imagine Paul making his case in the book of Acts right here in this place.
In Acts chapter 26, we see that Paul is near the end of his life. Right before he's shipped over to Rome and goes through a bunch of different stuff, he is here in prison in Caesarea Maritima. He's in prison during this time because many of the Jews want to kill him and they call him a blasphemer, someone who is against what the Jewish people believe. So he's standing here, making his case in front of the grandson of Herod the Great, the last king of Judea.
And this right here is possibly where King Agrippa could have sat, looking down at Paul, judging him, saying actually he's done nothing wrong, and yet he still is not let out of prison because he has to go to Rome.
Continuing north to the palace area, we can actually see where Paul stayed. Right underneath the palace is where the prison cells have been found here in Caesarea Maritima. This is a recent discovery.
In Israel, they're always doing new excavations, even at sites that have been found years and years ago. They're just now excavating this prison cell, which is almost certainly the prison cell that Paul would have stayed in. See, this, when we were here just last year, was not here. All of this was not dug out like this, but now they're actually excavating what is most likely Paul's prison that he stayed in for 2 years here at Caesarea Maritima.
And of course, since we're here, that
brings us to right here, which is the palace that Herod built on this location. Now, of course, this is used by him, but also all the governors and different people that stayed here in Caesarea Maritima during their time in office. People like Felix or even Agrippa would have stayed here from time to time. And of course, you can see the ruins all around this area where the palace once stood. Now, this is actually a really cool area as well. You can see that Herod actually built a pool here. This, of course, would have been a beautiful view out of the palace. It would have just been amazing. You can even see right here, this is original mosaic floor. This is taking such inspiration from the Romans and really making it feel like a completely Roman town, even though it was made by a Jewish king.
You can see in this image here how the palace and the rest of the city would have looked when it was fully intact.
As you can see behind me, Caesarea Maritima is absolutely massive. From the theater over here all the way down to the port, way down there. This city is amazing.
And that large span of sand that you're seeing in between me and the port, this is the hippodrome.
The main horse races and hippodromes like this would have been very deadly, not only for the riders, but also for the horses. This was one of the main things that actually brought people to want to watch these matches, was the excitement of seeing this dangerous sport actually happen. Really, really crazy stuff.
Now you're sitting in the best seats in the entire house. I'll show you this whole row over here, but this is where the most famous, most wealthy people would sit, because of course all the action happened right here, where all the people would crash, maybe even die.
This hippodrome in particular is also known as a hippo stadium, and that is because it's not only for horse races, but also all other kinds of games and gladiator type things. There would have been a bunch of different stuff that would have happened here, including the death of many Christians. So that would have been the major difference between the sporting events happening here and the entertainment in the theater. While these other buildings and areas are really important to what Caesarea Maritima was, the most important area by far is the port to the north of the city. This is where everything took place. This port could hold hundreds of ships and was the largest port in the area by far. This is where a ton of the supplies that Herod used throughout the entire land would come into, from all over the place, all the way from Rome to all the other nations around the Mediterranean. Everything was funneled through this port here in Caesarea Maritima.
Now, of course, these big monuments are not the only things that are super important in this city. In fact, look at the city itself. This is actually a bathhouse, and of course, going along with that Roman theme, of course Herod would want a bathhouse where men could come and work out and bathe and even sit together naked. Of course he would want that, right? Because it's a very Roman thing to do. But beyond all of that, one of the most important things that happened in this city was something that I like to call Pentecost number 2, because somewhere buried in all of these ruins here is actually where the Gentiles first received the Holy Spirit. As you know, Pentecost in Jerusalem, Jews came to Christ in numbers like they had never seen before, and that's when God released the Holy Spirit onto them. They started speaking in tongues, and a lot of crazy things happened. Well, did you know that at Caesarea Maritima is when the Gentiles received the Holy Spirit for the first time through Cornelius and his family and through Peter?
You see, Cornelius was a Roman centurion, part of the Italian cohort to be more specific. And he was sent an angel by God to tell him to go and get Peter, who was north in Joppa. Around that same time, Peter gets a vision from God, showing him that all the things that he sees as unclean are no longer unclean. The main purpose of this vision is to show Peter that the Gentiles are now a part of what God is doing, and they are just as much a part of this as the Jewish people are. So even though it's insanely illegal, he goes to Cornelius, and Cornelius at first even starts to worship him, and Peter corrects him, telling him that he too is just a man. Peter then goes on to explain the good news to them of the gospel in Jesus Christ. And then in that moment, as he's explaining these things, all the people around him, including the Gentiles, the uncircumcised enemies of the Jews, were given the Holy Spirit. And they started extolling God and praising him.
And the Holy Spirit was unleashed here for the Gentiles, letting Peter know that it's not just the Jews that receive the Holy Spirit, but that everybody has access. And that's when my life was completely changed. And yours most likely too. In the hills of the Galilee, we find ourselves in another amazing ruined town. Now, of course, this is a very important town to Scripture, but not in the way that you may think that it is. This is one of the most well-preserved synagogues and locations of the first century, and one of the places that we know for sure that Jesus was. Today we find ourselves in the ruins of one of the most well-known towns in all of the Bible. And that's not because this town was particularly huge or amazing, but actually one person in the Bible made it well-known to all of us, and that would be Mary Magdalene. So welcome to Magdala. In this video, we're going to talk to you about where Magdala is, why it's important, and show you some of the most amazing things that have been found here in Magdala overall, including a first century synagogue that we know for sure Jesus taught in.
So first things first, let's talk about time period and location when it comes to Magdala. In terms of time period, this city was very important during the first century, during that time of Jesus period. It was actually destroyed in 68 AD by the Romans, and this is because there was a huge rebellion kind of going on all over Israel during that time, and of course this is when the temple was destroyed as well, right at 70 AD. In terms of location, we have to talk about the Galilee overall. We're going to be talking about several different locations all around the Sea of Galilee, and so we have to talk about how important this location actually is. Not only did Jesus do most of his ministry in this direct area, but this area is really important to how Israel functions overall. The Sea of Galilee is really the only large body of fresh water that Israel has at its disposal. While Israel actually has a ton of different water sources depending on where you are, the Sea of Galilee, of course, is the most prominent freshwater body in this whole entire area. Most of the other water sources that you're going to be looking at in Israel are all aquifers that are underground, and sometimes they can be really hard to get to depending on where you live. So the Sea of Galilee is the most readily available freshwater source that kind of flows throughout Israel. Now, of course, remember, this comes from all the way from the north through the Sea of Galilee, down the Jordan River, and ends at the Dead Sea. So this is a really, really important body of water. As we look back at our topographical map, we can actually zoom into the Galilee area. And you can see that the Sea of Galilee basically forms a bowl here, where all of the water is funneled into this large kind of center area where we see the Sea of Galilee today. This gives us context for so many different things in the Bible, including the weather that we hear described at different points. For example, when they're on the sea and then randomly a storm will appear out of nowhere. This happens all the time at the Sea of Galilee because of the topographical area that is around this specific focal point. Now, Magdala specifically is on the far western point of the Sea of Galilee. This would have made for a great bay, a place to build boats and to launch them from this port, but of course this would have made perfect sense as Magdala was a fishing village. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second.
But first, here is the first century synagogue. There's a couple of things that are really amazing that were actually found in this location, but first, just take a look at this. Is this what you imagined a synagogue to look like? Take a look at the area around it, how it's shaped, and how big it is. It's not very big at all. Here is the entrance to the synagogue, and as you can tell by these benches, they think that this was actually a study hall. And this would have been used as some sort of Beit Midrash for Magdala in particular. Remember, this is a Jewish town, and if they had a synagogue, they would want to train up new rabbis, etc., etc. So here is where they would do that. Imagine students studying in this area. After they've gone to a mikveh and cleansed themselves, they would come here to Beit Midrash or to the synagogue in order to hear the rabbis teach. And then that brings us here to the main room of the synagogue. This is where the teaching would have been done and where most of the rabbis, Pharisees, and people that were in this town to learn would go in here to hear the rabbi teach, and that includes Jesus. It says in the scriptures that Jesus went to all the towns in Galilee and he taught at their synagogues. Of course, this is really close to Capernaum where Jesus' base of operations was, and of course he would have come here. Not only do we know that because of this verse that talks about him going to all these different synagogues, but also he met Mary Magdalene, and most likely he healed her in this area here. Take a look at this room right here. You can see that several of the pillars here would have held up the roof that used to be here. They think that most likely this was made out of wood and probably some sort of earthen material, as a lot of roofs would have been during that time. But you can also see that there are many benches around this synagogue area. Just imagine how filled up this place would have been during the times that Jesus came and spoke here. A lot of people didn't agree with him during the time that he was alive, but a lot of people really started to follow him, especially in this area of Galilee, which would have made this synagogue really important to those people, hearing him maybe for the first time speak about the good news and the truth of what heaven actually is. Now, before I forget, let's talk about this box right here. Why is it so prominent in this synagogue? Well, this is a replica, but that box was actually found here. And this is another major discovery that happened here in Magdala. You see, all throughout history, we've had struggles with people denying that the Second Temple even existed, or if it did, what it looked like or what the purpose of it was. Was this something that everybody cared about, or just the people in Jerusalem? Or did it go beyond that? We've learned over the years that, of course, the Second Temple was incredibly important, but this box right here actually houses images of what the Second Temple could have been like, at least pieces of it. Things like Solomon's portico, or even ornate things like the curtains at the Second Temple. This was a really, really cool thing, and it helped us to understand the Second Temple a lot more. And I want to emphasize how amazing this discovery is. The Magdala stone and even this synagogue weren't even located until 2009. Much of this land wasn't even owned by someone who wanted to excavate it until 2006. So a lot of this is so much more amazing than we give it credit for. And to be here is a real privilege. And in fact, just to overstate it even more, me and Vanessa are the only ones that are in this place at all right now. The gift shop is closed. The entrance is not even the same entrance that you normally walk in. It's totally different than we've ever experienced before.
And while part of this is really exciting and it's great that we get to film and be here for a long period of time by ourselves, There's also part of it that's very, very sad, knowing that tourism has not really returned since October of 2023.
19 days since the worst terror attack in Israeli history.
Literally, I've never seen this before. Vanessa and I were here in Magdala for over 2 hours completely alone. And not until the very end of our time there did we see another single person in this area. Not even anyone that was staying in this hotel. And trust me, we need to talk about this hotel.
But real quick before we get to that, I wanted to thank Imagine Tours and Travels for sponsoring this trip and this video. Imagine is one of the most amazing tour companies in the world, as its foundations really started back in the 40s, and now all of that experience is here today for Israel. They're the ones that let us do this trip safely and efficiently. They helped us to plan out every single step, and they could help you too. If you want to plan a trip with your church or a ministry or just a group of friends, they could help you to really make sure everything happens exactly as it needs to. They know all the ins and outs of Israel, as well as several other locations in Europe, Greece, Rome, you name it, and they could take you there. There's a lot of different things that they do logistically that really helped out with this trip and would help out with yours as well. If you guys want to check out Imagine, go to ittworld.com, and I'll leave a link in my description so you guys can go there really quickly. Now, one thing that we need to talk about is the existence of this hotel right here. Of course, there's some kickback that I've heard from a lot of different people when it comes to this hotel, because underneath it is certainly more ruins of Magdala that have not been uncovered, and yet the hotel exists here covering them up. So what is the play here? Do you make a hotel and make money and have Magdala be a place that people come and stay? Or, well, do you uncover all these excavations and let it be an open site like that? Well, obviously in this case, the people that own this location decided to build this hotel here. And I've heard from many people that this is a horrible decision, but I'm sure others also love to stay here and they think it's an amazing location for a hotel. So I don't know, it's a hard thing. Tourism in Israel is always this fight, right? Do you want to keep everything as it was meant to be or as it was back in the 1st century? Or do you want to keep it as it was during a later period in time or earlier period in time? Or do you just create something new in that location? I don't know. It's really difficult. I love that they kept most of the ruins here, but it is a shame that we're losing a piece of Magdala underneath this hotel. In the hills and the mountains of the Galilee are some really important biblical sites, including Magdala, Capernaum, Bethesda, Chorazin. There's a lot of different places here that, well, we can learn a lot from. And as amazing as Magdala is, we have to understand where it fits in society. What was important here in Magdala? As you can see, this is a pretty large area and a pretty big city. I mean, especially for Jesus' time. Magdala is known for its fishing, and specifically it actually helped with Rome selling them a fish oil called garum. And this was a huge product of Magdala. It actually made them a ton of money and made them very popular during the time of Jesus and afterwards. This was known as the fish city to the Romans, to the Jews, and to everybody in between. And the closer that we get to the Sea of Galilee, the more you're going to see boats being made, or even places to house live fish. This is a massive, massive business, not only for Magdala, but the surrounding areas as well. Just a few miles up the road is Capernaum. And of course, we know several fishermen from that town in particular. And Magdala most likely would have been a hub for all their type of businesses that they dealt with. So Peter, James, John, and Jesus all would have been here at some point, I'm sure of it. And another amazing thing that's at this city of Magdala, of course we have the 1st century synagogue, then that means that we have to have mikveh somewhere. Mikveh are the cleansing pools that they would use every single time they go to synagogue. So not only does that mean that these mikveh are here and amazing, but also that almost certainly, like in my mind 100%, Jesus was in one of these mikveh here in Magdala. Really cool. They've even filled this one up with water here to show what it would look like with filled water. I don't think this is a natural spring. I think they are pumping in water here, but still really cool to see this. Now, my hypothesis, at least for this mikveh, is that you would walk down one side of the staircase, you would cleanse yourself, and then you would walk out the other side of the staircase in order to be cleansed. Now, you would be naked in here, obviously, so this could have been the women's mikveh, and then there's the men's side on the other side. So I'm not 100% sure how it would have worked here, and I'm sure that the researchers aren't 100% sure either, but we have some good guesses as to what these could be. Of course, these definitely look like Jewish mikveh from everything else that we've seen from all the other locations that we have here in Israel. Now, this area right here is where the domestic houses were for Magdala, at least the ones that we've uncovered. They know this because they found things like food preparation zones, glass, different coins and things like that that would have been found in a household, including pottery, which is one of the most common things you find in an archaeological dig like this one. These are houses that were in existence during the 1st century, during the time of Jesus. That's amazing. They could just go, I don't know, 20 or 30 yards to the synagogue, or right across the street to the mikveh right behind the camera. But if we think about it, one of these houses could have belonged to Mary Magdalene herself, which is a cool thought to have. Although we don't really know, and I don't know that we could ever really find out.
If you want to see a walkthrough of Magdala, we actually have that posted up on our Patreon, so go ahead and check that out over there at snipesupport.com. That would be the best way to help support us on these videos right here. Thank you so much. Throughout our Israel series so far, we've been talking about places that we know for sure historical things have happened. However, there are a lot of different places within Israel that we know for sure something didn't happen, or it's kind of a toss-up. We're not exactly sure. So how do we differentiate these different types of sites? Well, for us during this Israel series, we're gonna do it like this. An A site is a site that we know for sure this thing happened there, either historically or biblically or whatever else. We know that it happened there. It's like a 99% chance that this is the place. Then a B site is somewhere that we're not 100% sure. Maybe it's 60%, maybe it's 50%. There's a lot of evidence, but we're not 100% sure that it could be exactly here. Then a C location would be, yeah, it probably didn't happen here. There might be some evidence, but yeah, really, this is just a claim that something happened here. So today we're actually gonna be looking at our first site that is not an A site.
Now this video is our first example of a B site. This is the Mount of Beatitudes, and behind me is the Church of the Beatitudes. This is an area where they believe the Sermon on the Mount happened. And it's really interesting and fun to look at in terms of historical, archaeological, and really traditional evidence overall. But this is what we would call a B site, meaning we don't exactly know where Jesus stood or what happened, but this could definitely be the location of the Sermon on the Mount. So far, we've only really looked at A sites, places that we know are the location that we're saying that it is. Things that happen there historically, even outside of the Bible, that really help us to pinpoint these locations. However, this is a location in which really we don't 100% know. So why do we call this the Mount of Beatitudes, or the place where the Sermon on the Mount happened? Well, let's break it down, because it comes down to about 3 or 4 factors.
But before we get to that, let's jump into our maps and talk about exactly where this location is. We're talking about the northeastern portion of the Sea of Galilee, up into the hills quite a bit. This is an overlook over the Sea of Galilee, and you have an amazing point of view from here. To give you another perspective, here's a photo from Capernaum looking up at the Church of the Beatitudes. So you can see how a ton of people would be able to fit on this hill here.
Now, as you'll be able to see, obviously this church, as you'll see all over Israel, is controlled by the Catholic Church. You can see nuns that live here and work here, and they take care of and make sure that everything is good here on the Mount of Beatitudes. This is a very common thing because the Catholic Church bought up a ton of this land out here, and they're the ones that are cultivating it and making sure that it's able to be visited and taken care of. Now, sometimes this is a great thing, sometimes this can be a bit hard, and groups disagree all the time. So depending on what type of church you're a part of, what tradition of Catholicism or Orthodox Christianity or whatever else that you're a part of, this could determine how you interact with these different sites. For example, we're going to go to Capernaum soon, and while we're going to see a big part of Capernaum, there's another church that owns a secondary half of Capernaum that has not been excavated and probably won't be, because they're not interested in doing so. So it's kind of a fighting battle here. There's politics and everything, and that includes spaces here in Israel, specifically because, well, there's a ton of it everywhere, and people are always wanting to turn it into tourism spots and make money off of it. This is something that has always left a bad taste in my mouth when I come to Israel. I wish it could be more open and free, but because of the differing beliefs and everything else, it kind of makes it difficult from time to time. Now, the first thing biblically that tells us this could be the spot, along with basically everything else you see here, is that this is by the Sea of Galilee. Behind me, you're seeing the lake that is so fundamental to this area. It's the lifeblood, giving fish, water, and everything else to this area, making sure that people can live here. This is a massive differentiation from the Dead Sea, where basically nothing can live without modern intervention. That doesn't really narrow down this spot. It's just one thing that factors into this could be the spot, right? So let's move on to the next one. Now, if this is the place of the Sermon on the Mount, there's not really anything that we would be able to dig into, right? It says that Jesus basically spoke on the side of a hill, and we don't really know where that could be, and there's no building that would show us that, right? Well, for the most part, that's correct. But in Christian tradition, we actually have a long history, several centuries, all the way back to basically the 4th century, that brings us to this place as a traditional spot where people would actually come as a pilgrimage, just like I'm doing right now. So people from all across the nation of Israel and beyond would come here as the spot that the Sermon on the Mount happened. And especially later on, as time went on, things built up and built up and built up to where this church was built to really signify that this is the spot. And while we don't have a building that gives us an inscription that says, hey, this is where the Sermon on the Mount happened, we can actually see that there's a tradition that lasts for a long period of time, for centuries and centuries and centuries long, even back to the 4th century BC. And we know that because there's actually remains of a Byzantine church dedicating this spot to the Sermon on the Mount here at this location. And so with all of those things put together, we have a little bit better of an argument to say that this is the spot. Although a lot of things here are kind of debated, right? We don't know the exact location. We don't know exactly where Jesus stood, and even the way in which he delivered his message is debated here. A lot of people will see this hill and they assume that Jesus is on the top of the hill speaking down to everybody and giving them a message. Maybe that's the best way that his voice would carry. But actually, a lot of people have come to the conclusion and theorized that Jesus was closer to the Sea of Galilee and speaking up the hill to everybody else, almost like an amphitheater, just like we saw at Caesarea Maritima, and we're going to see in other locations like Beit She'an. There's a lot of different things that we could debate here, and we don't really know. But the truth is, it doesn't matter, because we can still read in Matthew the best sermon ever given. So what do you think? Is this the spot that Jesus gave his message of the Sermon on the Mount, or did it look more like this?
Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life.
Either way, this is an amazing place. They take great care of it, and the history here seems to suggest that somewhere around here is where Jesus gave that sermon. Now, all you have to do is remember,
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you, when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
today's location is one of my favorites, and not because it's this amazing biblical location with all these references, but it's actually one of the most well-preserved archaeological sites that we can actually take part in, be in, and actually touch these different stones that are around.
In the northwestern corner of the Sea of Galilee is a triangle where Jesus did most of his ministry. This spans between Capernaum, Bethesda, and the place where we're going today. And these three locations are where Jesus did 80% of his ministry, especially in the Galilee area.
This is Chorazin. Chorazin is one of the three cities in which Jesus cursed: Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida. If we can visit the other two, we'll definitely try. But this is one of my absolute favorite locations in all of Israel. But first, before we get started in looking at some of these amazing things, let me talk about just the first century cities here. Obviously, as you can see, they're made out of stone. A lot of times when we see adaptations or movies, or even in The Chosen sometimes, we see these wooden and stucco houses that wouldn't actually have been super accurate to the first century. Now, some of these houses may have been made out of stone and then had an outer coating to make them look more beautiful, but for the most part, this is what it would have looked like. These black stones that are just everywhere on the countryside here in Israel, especially in the Galilee area. So when we think about Jesus' home in the Galilee, or Peter's home in the Galilee in Capernaum, then it would look a lot more like this than we imagine it to. And that misconception goes way beyond just what the houses looked like, but think to yourself about Christmas time, and what did the manger look like? Well, would you be surprised to know that this is a manger? This is what animals would have eaten out of, because of course, if you're in this environment, you have these big black stones everywhere, you're gonna be making most of your things out of them. There's not much wood around here. Even though there's trees growing now, there probably wouldn't have been much growing at the time of Jesus.
Now, as we get into talking about Chorazin in particular, a lot of what you're going to see here is actually from the 4th century, a little bit later on in the late Roman period or the early Byzantine period, but this is still a Jewish town during that time. Now, obviously, the 1st century town would be underneath this town, and that includes the synagogue and some of the other things that we're going to look at during this video here. So I'll be going back and forth referencing the 4th century and the 1st century here as we talk about these different areas throughout Chorazin. Obviously, underneath all of this is where the city that Jesus would have visited is.
One of the most amazing areas at Chorazin is this area right behind me. This is a mikveh, one of 2 sets basically that are sitting right here. Most likely these were 2 different sets, one for males, one for females, and then they would be able to cleanse themselves for the ritual things that are in Judaism. Now this was extremely important. If you don't know what a mikveh is, this is a cleansing bath. You would walk down this set of stairs, you would cleanse yourself, and then you would walk back up the other side, showing that you've been spiritually cleansed. It was more about just getting clean. It was more than just about, making sure that you were healthy and that your body was not dirty, but that you're spiritually really clean when you're going into these certain rituals. For example, whenever you're going to synagogue, you would go into this mikveh. Whenever you're going to do specific feasts or different things like that, you have to be clean going into those. So if you're ritually unclean, you have to come in here, cleanse yourself, and then go and do whatever you're going to do. So this is one of the few places in Israel that you can actually go, see, and touch, and be a part of the history that you're looking at. Not just from afar, not just behind a pane of glass, not just behind some fencing, but right here, where it all happened. As you can see behind me, these buildings would have been obviously completed buildings for the mikveh to sit inside of, each of them for male or female. Now, this obviously would have been because when you go to a mikveh, you're going naked to go and bathe yourself for these ritual cleansings. And when Jesus did this, it wasn't because he was actually, spiritually unclean, but rather that he was ritually unclean, meaning that he probably at some point touched like a dead animal or raw meat, or he touched blood or bodily fluids, right? Meaning that in the Jewish society, he was unclean and needed to use the mikveh before he went to the synagogue or did anything else within the faith there. So here we're seeing all these buildings here and how they're unfinished, obviously now after many earthquakes and time destroying them. But some of these have been able to be rebuilt or restored in order for us to see what they would have looked like during their time and exactly where they were as well. This is really, really a cool experience.
Chorazin really is one of my favorite, if not my favorite place in all of Israel. But if you want to experience Chorazin and many other locations which are just fantastic to be a part of, then you can go to Israel with us in December. If you're thinking about going on this trip with us, you can save your spot by using your phone to scan this QR code and registering for $500 to save your spot.
As I'm sure I'll say several times in all of these videos, one of the most amazing things about Israel is that it is ever changing. So if you came here 10 years ago, it is vastly different than what it is now. In fact, many things have been discovered in just the last few years. For example, I was here a year ago, just barely over a year ago, and this entire space is completely different than it was before because they were doing active excavations during that time. So we actually got to see how things were unfolding in real time. It was really amazing. Now behind me right here is a large paved courtyard along with several dwelling places. This would have been either one gigantic house. I don't think that's what it was. I think it was several houses over here. And then over here we have a large paved courtyard for people to come out and to have different festivities there. It's really interesting to see that they would have a courtyard like this. I wonder how much Roman influence was in there versus Jewish influence and what actually happened here in the city. It's hard to know all of that stuff, but what we can know is that this existed right here, and this is where people actually lived. One of the major reasons why it's so cool that we have ruins like this is because it gives us a better understanding of how these people lived during their time. For example, this door right here. This is the door to a dwelling behind it. Why is it so small? Well, we have to ask ourselves these questions when we come upon things that are so abnormal like this. This would have been normal during the time, but for us in modern day, it doesn't make any sense as to why this door would be so small. So we have to ask ourselves questions like, were they just this small? Were they 3 feet tall and they had the doorways like that? That's why they built it so small? Well, no, the doorway would have been this small, but most likely the buildings would have been much taller. As you can see behind me, there's other walls that are much, much taller than this door. And we see other buildings all throughout the Jewish society that are much, much bigger and obviously not 2 or 3 feet tall, right? And our skeleton records also show us exactly how tall these people were as well, right? So this could be for a couple of different reasons, but one of those reasons is for defense. It would make this really hard to enter this building attacking the people inside with weapons and armor. You'd have to crouch down and kind of get inside. You'd be really vulnerable, especially if you're going head first into a building. So from the inside, it makes it really easy to defend as well. And to the left side of this dwelling, you can actually see that clearly this is still under archaeological excavation. So actively, they're working on this site right now. That means if you were to come here later this year or next year, this may be open to you to walk into, and they could have found new things here. Who knows what is hiding under the ground here. There could be an inscription from some important person, or, one of the apostles could have visited here and told us something that we didn't know before. There's so many really cool things that could corroborate things from the Bible that could be really anywhere here. So it's so exciting to see these archaeological excavations being done all over the place. Now, this to me is probably the crown jewel of Chorazin.
This is the synagogue, and underneath this is where the first century synagogue would have stood during the time of Jesus. Remember, most of these buildings that you're seeing here are from the late 3rd to early 4th century AD.
And we're going to talk about how it was restored and what's kind of going on over here. But there's a huge hint here as to why Jesus would curse this city. And it's really interesting the more that you look into it. But let's check out this synagogue because it's one of the most amazing finds and one that you can actually walk into and be a part of. Man, I love Chorazin. This right here is the corner of the ancient synagogue, and you can clearly see that they're restoring this piece of it right here. This is a common thing that you'll see done in first century areas, or really any area, whether it's Byzantine, Crusader, or anything else. You can see them restoring pieces of this as to preserve it and show you the shape of the actual building. But clearly, there's a differentiation between the black stone and the white stone here that is newer than the original here. So you can see the original black stone is pretty much everywhere over here. These stones are actually in really, really good shape.
And these white stones right here
are a restoration of what is actually going on to show you how tall this building would have been, to show you what it would have looked like. And of course, they wouldn't do the entire building like this because they want to preserve as much of it as possible so that it's as original and authentic as possible as well. Now, no matter how amazing this synagogue and this city actually is, Jesus still cursed it. And why is that? Well, in scripture, we read that he cursed it because he did so many miracles. He did so many things in this area to prove that he was the Messiah, and yet they still didn't believe. They still walked away from him. And so they were cursed because they, out of everybody, should have been the ones that believed in him, and yet they didn't. And that includes Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethesda. These 3 cities no longer exist in a modern sense. There is no modern city of Chorazin. It just doesn't exist because they were cursed and destroyed. And I think that there are definitely hints here as to why that could be. For example, look at these different details on the synagogue building top. On top of this building were details that really resemble Roman architecture, and not only in the way that they're designed and the way that they look, but also the characters that they use. For example, on this first century synagogue, look at what's behind me. Right here, we have this detail with a face and then lines going all around the outside of the face. This is a resemblance of Medusa, one of the Greek Gorgons, a mythological creature. So imagine what kind of influence the Roman culture had on this area in particular. We see symbols just like this in Roman architecture and Roman ruins, but to see it here, in a city that Jesus was often a part of, it's hard to kind of swallow, but you can definitely see where that downfall started and who these people may have become. You can see once we get inside that this is about 4 or 5, maybe 6 times as big as the one in Magdala, and you can actually go inside this and interact with a lot of things going on. They've done a lot of work to restore this location, and this is a little bit different philosophy than what we have over in Magdala. Magdala is more of an excavation, it's just kind of showing you what was there. There's parts of that here, but in this specific building, they're actually restoring it, using the stones that were originally used and putting them back in place in order to show you what this would have looked like. For example, the top of this building right over here, that obviously is not on the top, but it's reconstructed down here in order to show you what it would have looked like, and that would have been up above on the building. Now, any of you builders out there are going to be really confused by this set of stairs. This is obviously not a very well-made set of stairs, or so you would think at first glance. But in actuality, remember that these stairs are leading to the synagogue. So just like the temple in Jerusalem, which we'll talk about later, these steps are intentionally misaligned, and they're different sizes for each step. And that is because they don't want you to walk unmindfully into the synagogue. They want you to be very intentional and focused. And so in order to help you to do that, these stairs are different heights. So you can never get in the muscle memory rhythm of going up these stairs quickly or running into the synagogue. You would have to slowly take each step and understand where each step is, otherwise you would trip and fall. This was extremely intentional for most synagogues, and especially the temple in Jerusalem. Now let me show you what's on the inside and where Jesus would have taught here in Chorazin. Then I'll also show you one of the most amazing finds ever found in any site in Israel, and it has a direct tie to Scripture. After visiting the mikveh and cleansing themselves, they would obviously come into here and receive a teaching from the rabbi. And this is probably the Beit Midrash as well. Students would come in here to learn and to talk about the Torah, to argue and fight about certain theological issues. There's so many things that I'm sure happened in this room. One of the most important things, probably the most important thing, is that Jesus was here. Most likely speaking to a crowd right over here and speaking about what is to come, the kingdom of heaven, and giving them the words of truth. And yet they didn't listen. That's why this city is cursed. They didn't hear what he had to say. I mean, can you imagine hundreds of people packed in here listening to Jesus speak, or another rabbi? They're talking about the Torah. They're arguing about certain things. The Pharisees from all over are coming to see what is happening here.
Just like in Magdala, you can actually see that the benches on the sides of the walls is where they would sit. Much different than what we have today with, our chairs or our pews or whatever else in a church service. And so this is where they would have sat. You can also see the reconstruction here of the new seats versus the old seats, and how well the old seats have actually held up for the ones that weren't either crumbled or misplaced. Overall, you can see how beautiful and magnificent this building would have been 2,000 years ago. If you want to see a full walkthrough of this entire site here at Chorazin, then you can go over to our Patreon at snipesupport.com, and there's a whole, I think, 32-minute video of us walking through the entire place and explaining every little thing.
Now, there are some other things that they actually found in this room. Other than these decorative pillars and different things, they also found a decorative column that was probably a part of the Ark of Law, and that is where they would hold all the scrolls for the synagogue. But the most important thing that they found was actually something called the seat of Moses. This is something that's mentioned in Scripture, but we really didn't know what it looked like or what it was until we found it here in Chorazin. Now, this is mentioned in Scripture. Jesus talks about those who sit on the Moses seat, and this is often thought to be the seat of one of the most important people within the synagogue. This was held for nobility or very famous people that were coming to the synagogue to visit. And so they would sit here and they would have, a place of honor within the synagogue. Jesus talks about it in this verse right here.
In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. While some people will argue that this is a metaphor, some people will say this is a physical seat, and this is what Jesus was talking about. As always, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. This was a seat that was used during the time of Jesus that obviously shows this was someone of importance, right? But it also was a metaphor, clearly talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were the leaders of the law during the time of Jesus.
Now, this one in particular is actually a replica. The real one is in the Israel Museum, so maybe we'll see that in a later video. To be completely honest, there's much too much to show you in one sitting here in Chorazin. There's a lot of things to show you, including this house that I'm next to right now, an olive press, a wine press, and of course, all the other things that we looked at in this video. But the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about was this path right behind me. This is the same or similar path that Jesus would have taken from Capernaum to Chorazin every single time he came here. This would have been the way that he traveled throughout this area, and these are the things that he would have seen. These hills are the same hills, these rocks are the same rocks, this weather is the same weather. And so we can see that Jesus took inspiration from a lot of these different things in order to tell the parables that the people during his time would understand. That includes the parable of the sower. On our trip last year, we brought Brandon Robbins and David Tate, and Brandon Robbins did the teaching at this spot, Chorazin, since he was the only one that had been here before. And one of the things that he taught us about this path is that this may have been the place that Jesus took inspiration for the parable of the sower. Imagine you're walking along the path and you see these different plants growing all around. I can see them all around me right now. You see the thorns and the thistles, you see the stones and the rocks, you see how the sun could bake down and really take advantage of these plants that aren't ready to grow in their natural environment. You see how these things can crop up and be taken advantage of, but then you see the plants that are planted in good soil, and you see how they thrive and how they grow and how beautiful they are. These are the same exact things that Jesus would have used as inspiration for his parables as he spoke to the people of the Galilee. Of course, he's using their environment to relate to them, just like I do here on YouTube. It's my mission to be able to use the things in real life to be able to relate to you and then teach you about Scripture or other things beyond that. So here I am in Chorazin, the same place that Jesus was, the same area that he lived, worked, and taught. And now we're seeing exactly what he would have seen. I wish I could spend 10 hours here and show you absolutely everything. But the truth is, I just don't have that time. I have other sites I need to go to and other things I need to do. And quite frankly, it's above 85 degrees and burning hot out here today. It would help us out a ton if you would subscribe to the channel and share this video with a friend. Let them know what we're doing here in Israel and to follow along with our series. It's been a ton of fun and we're going to continue on for quite a while from here. Today, we're at Chorazin, and I'm not sure why, but I've actually never been here on any of my trips previously. This must be a location that is not super visited, at least as far as I can tell, but it is pretty interesting in terms of what we can talk about the traditions that are held here, as well as some ancient ruins from the 4th century Byzantine period. So there are some interesting things we're going to break down here today from Chorazin, and well, I hope you enjoy the ride. Let's go. First things first, we need to talk about the centerpiece of this entire place, and that is this monastery slash church behind me. This was built in the 4th century by the Byzantines, and as we've talked about before, this is a period that's way after Jesus, obviously. And so they believe that this is the location of one of Jesus's most popular miracles in Scripture, the one that is probably most interesting to a lot of people, and that is when Jesus comes over to the other side. So let's talk about where we are. So obviously, Jesus did most of his ministry in kind of a triangular area of Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethesda. But he was also on the other side of the Galilee from time to time as he traveled through the Decapolis and obviously down to Jerusalem. And so this is actually the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. I have rarely come over here to look at pretty much anything because most of the things that you visit over here are on the western side and normally the northwestern side. And so it's a completely different area over here. In the scriptures, we often hear Jesus refer to this, or the scriptures themselves refer to this as the other side. This is the other side of the Galilee, meaning it's not the side that they were normally on, but they go to the other side. And so they kind of traverse over here. Now, during one of those stories, we actually see as Jesus calms a storm coming across the Sea of Galilee from the area of Capernaum and Magdala all the way over to here near Chorazin. Now, the miracle that he does here is he heals the man that we know as Legion. We are Legion for we are many, right? There's a lot of demons that are possessing this one man. Jesus is able to exorcise those demons out of the man and put them into a herd of pigs. And then those pigs jump off a cliff into the Sea of Galilee. So just like some of our other sites, I would label this as a B site. We can't be 100% sure that this is the location. However, there are early testimonies and obviously a large church built in this area for that specific reason of marking this area as the location of that miracle. So there is some evidence, but it's kind of all traditional evidence. We can't know for sure. However, one of the things that I find really interesting about this location is just understanding the early Christians. I mean, the 4th century is not that far past Jesus's time, only about 300 to 400 years, right? So this is a really, really cool location to see how the early Christians would have acted in this place. They would have known that Israel is a territory in which they have a lot of things that Jesus did, and so they're obviously wanting to build buildings like this in order to preserve it and to tell people the story about what actually happened here. So it's really unique overall. So let's check out the church and see what else is around in this area. This is the church of the 4th century monastery. Of course, several of these rooms would have been used for room and board or food preparation or whatever else, storage, but this room was specifically the church from that 4th century Byzantine period. You can see all over the floor would have been this beautiful mosaic that just spans the whole area. You can see all different types of Christian symbolism all over it, and this mosaic is beautiful for sure. Remember, not until after Jesus had died and resurrected were people actually called Christians. And so these first Christian people within the first few hundred years of Jesus ascending, man, it's so cool to see what they would have done. And it looks so similar to what we do today, right? You've got one big, large room. You've got an area up front that seems to be, more of like an altar, somewhere where someone would speak. And then you also have over to the right over here, a baptismal area, which is just so like any church I've been in, right? So it's a really, really cool whole setup here that they would have as monks in this monastery. Really interesting stuff.
But real quick before we get to that, I want to let you know about snipesupport.com. This is the best way that you can help to support us on this channel, as well as get a ton of extra content, including full live walkthroughs of each of the locations we're talking about here in Israel. We've already put up a bunch of those over there, so you can go check those out if you'd like to. For as little as $5 a month, you could really, really help us here on the Snipe Life.
So anyway, we'll see you guys over there. Thank you so much, and let's get back to the video.
Now, obviously, knowing the significance of this place, it's interesting how they actually put in Greek inscriptions showing what this place was and who actually built it. This is a super common occurrence even today, you know, in the more modern Catholic Church. But we're seeing that this inscription here basically reads, "In the time of the most God-beloved Stephanos, the priest and abbot, was made the mosaic of the Festerian in the month of December, 4th indiction, in the time of the pious and Christ-beloved our King Mauritius, first consulate." This semicircular space is really important to how this would have worked as well. As you can maybe hear as I move into the space, my voice begins to echo even more and get louder and amplify throughout the space. And that is because of these rounded walls pushing all of the sound forward. So if the speaker was here talking, you'd be able to hear him even in the back of the room, which is a really cool architecture piece. All of these areas over here would have been different sectioned off areas, most likely for rooms or different things like that. There was an earthquake, I think in the 800s or the 900s, that actually destroyed most of this place. And so it got rebuilt after that for different purposes. And then eventually, obviously, it became non-used over time. So all of these are kind of guesses as to what these things were actually used for during those times, but definitely as if this was a monastery, there would have been rooms here, there would have been different things, including a crypt, which is right over here. Seems like right down here is where they would keep their dead, so fun place for sure. And then another example of how they would use this space is right next to the church, right through this wall. This is an olive press area. So you would crush the olives using this giant millstone right here, and then you would press them using this stone right here. And they would press down, probably using the same baskets that the Jews used back in the day. And then it would come out of this little slit in the rock and into this pool right here as a harvesting area for the olive oil. So that's really cool. I imagine they used it not only for consumption, but also for anointing oil as well. Now, of course, what kind of monastery would this be without a bathhouse? Of course, the Byzantines are basically Romans at a later time, right after the fall of the Roman Empire. And so there's a Roman bathhouse here, and this would have been used not only as a monastery, use, but also because pilgrims would come here as the place that Jesus did this miracle with Legion. And so they would come to this place to visit just like I'm doing now, and they would use this bathhouse right here. And real quick, I wanted to point these out. This is how they would actually heat the different tubs and stuff that are in here. And we'll talk about this a lot more when we get to Beit She'an. Just keep this in mind for a later video. So let me know in the comments below, what do you think about Corsi? Is this something that interests you, the early Christian church and what they built here? Obviously, this place doesn't hold as much biblical significance as some of the other locations that we've gone to, but there's a possibility that Jesus definitely did miracles here. And we know that he was around in this area. But more interesting to me, at least here, is just the understanding of the early Christian church, seeing how they lived and how they did worship. It always is, I don't know, it's funny to me to see those similarities between modern day and even back here. 300, 400 AD is a long time ago. And for our traditions to be continually, growing and coming into what we are now, I don't know, it's cool the similarities that we still had even back here.
Welcome back to our Israel series, and today we've got a brand new place for you called Tabga. This is a really interesting location, but it's kind of too small to do a full video on. So we're just going to be doing a live walkthrough just like this, and I'll be talking over it to show you exactly what's going on in this location. Now, we've done these live walkthroughs pretty much at every location that we went to in Israel, so if you want to see more of these live walkthroughs with some of my commentary and breaking it down a little bit more, then you can check that out over on snipesupport.com. This is where you can support us to keep on making videos like this, and we can show you more and more behind the scenes content, extra content, and different things like that. So thank you so much for those that support us over there, and if you want to go there, there's a link down in the description down below. So let's get into this. I'll let you experience some of the walkthrough just by yourselves, and then I'll do some commentary over it, and past me will actually talk in this video as well, just a little bit. So right here, you kind of see this quite often in a lot of these different locations. This is a grindstone for either olives or for wheat, depending on what they're using it for there. This map here shows you kind of where we are in the Galilee area. That's the Sea of Galilee, and then we're to the northwest here. This is directly down the road from Capernaum, like less than a 5-minute drive. It's right down the street. So this is right nearby where Jesus would have done all of his ministry in that area.
What's here?
This is basically where they think that Jesus did the miracle of the multiplication. But it's like I would say this is like a C site. Like, it's like, probably not. Probably not, but it does have an interesting history. Like, basically they're saying, like, first century, Jesus was definitely here. He did all these things, but nobody really knew it until the 4th century, and then they said this was the rock where the bread was placed, and stuff like that. So it's, I would say it's a C site of, like, I don't know, they kind of just made a church here later on. And there's not really any huge evidence, you know. So, yeah.
So what else is there to look at?
Inside, there's like the mosaic and stuff in the church. So basically, you can see there's this first church, which was in the 4th century. Then later on, the second church was in the 5th century. And then they kept on building upon it. And then in the 30s, 1930, there's a third church. So the mosaic floors are protected by these other buildings on top. So you can see like how things are being built up on one another there. So, like this mosaic that's really famous, this one, which we're going to go see, that wasn't made until 6th century. Yeah. So these are actually not, these are the German Benedictine monks here, not the Franciscans.
So that's the original.
Yeah. Yeah, that's when it was excavated. This is the original as well.
But you said that that wasn't made till the 6th century.
Correct. Yeah, this wasn't made till 6th century.
So that wasn't made until the 6th century.
Correct, but that's when it was being excavated in the 30s. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So if you didn't catch what we were talking about there, basically this is a site that happened later on. There's a pretty small chance this is actually where Jesus did the miracle of multiplication, known as the feeding of the 5,000 in the Bible. Obviously it could be, we're in Israel, we're on the Sea of Galilee, like it's right here, it happened around here somewhere, but to know the exact location, to know the exact rock, all of that kind of stuff is kind of hard to say. Vanessa's going to go into the church here in just a second, and I'll kind of show you where this mosaic is that's really, really famous. I'll input a picture here, as well as where the rock is that they say that the bread was placed when Jesus was doing the multiplication. Again, this is kind of like, do we really know? No, there's no way to verify all these things, but it is cool to see, and it is cool to be in this place in general. As with all churches, when you enter them in Israel, whether there's people there or not, they expect you to be quiet and be reverent. These are holy places, and especially if there's a holy site associated with it. So even though there's nobody in here, we're trying to be quiet and be respectful, as you always should. Oftentimes they'll have pamphlets like this as well, in multiple different languages for you to pick up and to check out if you want to know more information about the location that you're at. So they have it kind of chained off here, but if you look over to the left, there's a white table, and underneath that is the rock where they say that the miracle of the multiplication happened. So right here is where all the people were gathered, listening to Jesus teach, and this is where the multiplication happened, where he actually fed them. Obviously, we're not sure if this is actually the place. However, this is the rock that they say it is. You'll see in this close-up picture that there's actually some olive oil there as well. You can see the mosaic right in front of it, which is a very famous mosaic of the original floor here from like the 6th century. And so you can see the 2 fish and then the basket filled with 5 loaves there to show the multiplication. One thing that I will say is it was always really sad to go around to all these different locations and see how few people were here, even to the point that all of these shops, which are normally bustling with people buying things and helping to support these locations, were just completely empty. These shops had nobody in them. In fact, they were completely closed. I'm sure you would have to call ahead of time even to get access to them. This happened at pretty much every location we were at that normally has a gift shop or different things like that. Almost all of them were closed, just a completely different look as to what we're used to seeing. And that's pretty much it for the Church of the Multiplication here in Tabka. I love it when areas have models just like this. You can see the entire city of Beit She'an. And of course, this helps you to understand, but what if I could just show you the real thing? Beit She'an, also known as Scythopolis within the scriptures, is one of the most amazing places to visit today to learn about the Romans, what they built, and how they lived in their daily lives. Now, this location is far too big for me to go through every single aspect of it, but we're going to go through a few locations that give you a great idea of what this city was actually like, and hopefully give you some knowledge about how the Romans lived during the time of Jesus. While this city is massive, this isn't even the entire thing. Beit She'an is actually a modern day city, and so many of these buildings that we see in this city are actually on top of ruins that we're seeing here. This city would have been huge and expansive, going all across and having a massive wall around the entire thing. Now, today we're going to look at a couple of key features from this city in particular, but we're also here to talk about some biblical things, because while Beit She'an isn't really mentioned in scriptures, we know that Scythopolis, which is the city's name in the time of Jesus, was a huge part of it. But even before then, during the Old Testament, we have a pretty big event that actually happens here, not in the Roman city, but up on that hill up there. So stick around to the end of this video to find out what actually went on up there with Saul and even King David. Every time we take a group here, it's always like exploring Disney World for the first time. You're kind of hot and sweaty, you're moving around. This is a massive location, so you have to kind of walk all over the place, but it is one of the most special. And that is not necessarily because it's hugely biblically important, but because it gives you such a great idea of what the early Romans were like. A lot of this is 1st century or earlier. This city is actually one of the oldest cities in this area, period. The very starts of it happened long before Christ. But first, let's check out this building because it's way more impressive on the inside than the outside. Let's go in. Welcome to the theater. This is where entertainment would happen and still does happen from time to time. They do actually night shows here, doing different like light shows and things on the ruins of Beit She'an. But obviously this would have been where performances would have taken place, right down here. Maybe certain speeches or declarations would happen right down there. You can see that above me is a second deck that is more deteriorated, and then the bottom deck is definitely still intact for the most part. I'm always so in awe of how they were able to build these things even back, thousands of years ago. Without the equipment that we have now, it seems like we're making less and less beautiful things, but this is amazing for sure to see this. The Beit She'an theater overall would have been a central point to the Roman theater during at least as early as the 2nd century. This was a major point of Scythopolis and would have been an attraction far and wide for people to come here and to see what was actually going on here. The theater could hold approximately 7,000 spectators, and during its heyday, the theater hosted a variety of performances, including dramatic plays, musical events, and possibly even gladiatorial contests. Really interesting stuff. Now let's head over to the main street of this section of Beit She'an. Just like in our major cities today, we have a main street here in Beit She'an. You can see that it stretches all the way down to the end of the road here, and you have this massive row of columns that would have been so beautiful to see in its heyday. Obviously, there's been an earthquake that destroyed most of this city later on after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. But even this, in its ruinous state, is a beautiful sight, looking down this main street right here and up into the old city of Beit She'an that's on top of that hill right there. Now, this street was actually a Byzantine street that was made after the Romans by the Byzantines, and you can see that it's pretty much warped and destroyed all over the place. However, it is really cool design. You can see that these pavers actually go diagonally in order so that chariots and carts and different things wouldn't get stuck in the grooves in the street. Also, just like our streets today, we see that there's a slight bend to the sides. I'm sure it's exaggerated now because of the earthquakes and different things, but we can see that there's a bend to the side, and that would be because water would then shed to the sides of the street, making sure that it wouldn't pool up in the middle of the street here. Next up is this area right here. This is the bathhouse. This is very indicative of a Roman society for sure. They would have always had a big bathhouse like this where all the men could come and congregate, work out, bathe, and just hang out. It was a place where people would just meet and talk and discuss different philosophies and different things like that. So let's jump in here and let me show you the inside of this. As you can see, much of this bathhouse is still intact, and it gives us a really good idea of how they would have used it and what was actually going on here. Now, we have lots of examples of this throughout the Roman Empire, and especially here in Israel, all the different Roman cities that are just like this, and even smaller versions or different versions or things that are similar to this that we can kind of compare to in order
order to study and see exactly what is going on here. Now, what you're looking at here is actually through the floor of the actual floor where it would have been in this ancient bathhouse. You can actually see the floor over here that would have extended out across this entire space. So what are we looking at here? What are these pillars? Well, this is actually a system in order to heat the water. This wasn't just a cold bathhouse where you came and you sat in a cold pool with everybody else. This is a warm bathhouse where you would be able to basically heal your aches, or be able to wash yourself, or just be able to hang out with some bros in the hot tub, right? And so you can imagine hundreds of men are in here, you know, just hanging out, working out, or being in these tubs here, these massive tubs that would have been in these rooms here. And they would have been heated by steam going through the floor. So that's where the steam would travel through these pillars here in order to heat up the water and heat up the floor of this bathhouse. And right here is where they would have workers, or maybe slaves, stoke this fire in order to make sure that all the pools were warmed in this area. And behind you, there's even a public restroom right next to the bathhouse to make sure that everybody was taken care of right here in this place. I'll show you a more intact bathroom in just a second.
Let's go over some of the smaller things that I won't have time to get into in this video fully. First off, here's a baptismal that's found in Beit She'an, showing that later on the Byzantines and Christians that were here actually used this as a place of worship and to do different things. So right near the bathhouse is a baptismal. That's very, very cool. You can also see the rest of the city lies in ruins. This is because there was a large earthquake that came after Christ's ascension and actually destroyed most of the city. We see some pretty good examples of that with these large pillars that have been knocked over and have been left in place by the people that have been excavating this city. Some of them are massive, and I can't imagine how the Romans and the Byzantines would have put these in place. It's really, really impressive. We can also see here a market square where there would have been different vendors and different things set up in this area right here as well. Overall, you can totally imagine how people would have lived here on a daily basis, going to the market, then to the bathhouse, and then to the theater to see announcements or for events. There's so much here that just seems like a normal city, and that's exactly what it was, one of the largest cities in the Decapolis.
Now, while I can't show you everything, I had to show you this specific room within Beit She'an, because of course it's going to be the one that you guys want to see the most, and that would be the Roman bathroom. Now, of course, this room would have been enclosed for privacy, but you don't actually have much privacy, do you? There would be as many as 25, 30, maybe even 50 people in here at the same time, doing their business at the same time right here in this bathroom. You would have a stream that would flow in this canal behind me, and it would flow out just like a sewage system, and that was really, really smart of them to do. You also had this canal in front of you, I believe, either to wash your hands or to use a leaf and a stick as a form of tissue paper. And in the center of this floor, you would see different entertainers that would come in for the express purpose of just kind of getting your mind off of this situation that you're in with everybody else. Now, during the time of the Romans and even later periods, it wasn't a big deal at all to be naked in front of people. And so I'm sure many people would have gotten totally used to this. But for us today, this is a bit strange.
Now, I told you to stick around to the end if you want to learn more about Beit She'an from an Old Testament point of view. There are a few things that are actually really important about this city that have nothing to do with the Romans or the Byzantines or even the time of Jesus. See, Beit She'an has been a place, a city, for a really long time, all the way back to the 15th to the 12th centuries BC, long before Jesus was born. Actually, it was given to the tribe of Manasseh in the Israelites when they entered the Promised Land, and then after this, one of the most famous things about this city overall was actually that they hung Saul's body from the city walls. This happens in 1 Samuel chapter 31, as we see that the Philistines, who controlled the city at the time, actually found Saul and his 3 sons. They cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to the wall of Beit She'an. This is where Saul's body was hung after he was killed. This very location right here.
I hope you've been enjoying this series so far. We're trying really hard to get this out to you as soon as we possibly can. Of course, I want to hear your thoughts about Beit She'an in the comments down below. What did you think was cool? What did you think was interesting? And what did you learn from this video? Anyway, we'll see you on the next one. Peace.
The Jordan River is the heartline of Israel. It brings water all throughout the entire nation and flows from north to south all the way through the Sea of Galilee, all the way down to the lowest place on earth, the Dead Sea.
During the time of Jesus, this was a major route throughout the entire nation, and in the modern day, it serves as the barrier between Israel and Jordan to the east. Throughout all of the Bible, the Jordan River was a major location for certain events and biblical stories, but I think most people know this as the place that John the Baptist baptized Jesus and declared him to be the Son of God and the Messiah coming into the world. Now, of course, we can't visit the entire Jordan River, but there are certain spots that are very special throughout it. Two in particular. There's one spot that is very touristy where everybody goes to get baptized. The water here generally flows faster and clearer and makes it a more pleasing place for people to actually get in the Jordan River. However, the place we're going today is the more traditional location where they believe the baptism of Jesus happened, as well as some other really unique and powerful biblical events.
So, is this what you thought it would look like? The Jordan River, milky brown as it is every time I've seen it here at Caesarea Yahud. This is a location where a couple of really interesting things happen. Two really interesting parallels of obviously hugely significant characters in the Bible. First of all, Jesus. This is most prominently known as the space that Jesus would have been baptized. This location, of course, in the Jordan River, we know that, but they say that this was the location in the wilderness where John the Baptist was actually baptizing people. Now, this is several miles away from Jerusalem. I'll kind of show it to you on the map about how far it is, but this is quite a big distance. So if people were coming out here to see John the Baptist, of course, it would have been a pretty big, momentous occasion for all of them to be here and to be baptized. It would have been a very life-changing thing, not just the flippant sort of like, oh, let's follow this random guy because he seems quirky, right? But if they're out here, it's because they really wanted to see John and hear what he had to say. And so it's really, really interesting. Of course, we can't know that for sure. This is what I would say is a B or C site, right? We don't actually know, but this is traditionally where it's held that this event happened. We don't have any archaeological evidence. We don't have any specific kind of things here. But there's other things that corroborate this or tie into it as well. It's not just that they say that Jesus' baptism happened here, but also some other events that are really key to that. So another paralleling event to Jesus' baptism, because remember, Jesus is baptized, then he goes into the wilderness. The opposite of that actually happened here for the Israelites. This is where Joshua brought the Israelites in to the promised land. So Joshua comes from the wilderness into the promised land. Jesus goes from the promised land into the wilderness for 40 days and begins his ministry. And so that parallel there, I don't think should be lost on anybody. We need to be able to look at those type of things and see what the Bible is trying to tell us in that. Now, this place is also significant secondarily because another parallel with Elijah. Elijah obviously being one of the biggest prophets in the Old Testament, and he has been known not to die, right? He goes actually and is ascended into heaven. And so they believe that near this spot was where that happened as well. So what parallels to that? Well, the same exact situation that we saw earlier, Jesus and John the Baptist. John the Baptist is said to be the Elijah to come, right? Like the new prophet that's supposed to come and make the way for the Lord. And that's exactly what he does. So if Elijah was taken up from here, it would make sense that John would be here as the new Elijah, making his way in his ministry, making the way for Jesus to come. Now, one thing you may be asking is about this church here, and what you don't see in this frame is actually several churches all across the other side of the bank. This is really interesting because on our trip so far, this is the closest that we've been to the Jordanian border. So right across this river is the Jordanian border, so you'll see soldiers on both sides and protection on both sides, making sure that everybody's safe and taken care of. Obviously, I've never been here when there's been an issue. I don't know if there has ever been an issue in this area, but it's nice to know that we're all kind of secured here, as everything is obviously in tension all over the place in this land. And just looking at my notes real fast, there are at least 6 different denominations, Christian denominations, that have made churches here, mostly on the Jordanian side. And that is the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and the Syriac Orthodox Church. So there are a bunch of different people on this side, and if you kind of get an aerial view, you can see all of these churches lined up in this area, all kind of claiming this piece of the Jordan River here. Now, while this is a B or a C site, I do like coming here rather than the other traditional Jordan River sites. The other sites are really touristy, and they actually try to sell you a lot of different things, including like robes or different things to get you to baptize in the river. Here, you can just come. It's totally free to come here. You don't have to pay anything, and you can just get in the river whenever you want. So this is a really, really a better place, I think, to come visit the Jordan River. Even though the other one may be less flies, this one's probably a little bit more authentic, and I like the feel of this one a lot more. It gives your group a lot of time to do whatever they want rather than kind of being cramped in a specific space in the other locations of the Jordan River. So Yeah, I'm not sure why all the flies are here. We are in the desert, so that makes sense, but also the water level is lower than I have ever seen it here. When I was here last year, it would have been way covering this camera. We would have been probably 4, 5, 6 feet underwater. And so the flies are coming out because of that too. All right, I think that's enough flies for me. Let me know what you think in the comments down below about this site, Caesarea Yahud, and the Jordan River right here.
I'm not in picture mode.
Welcome to the Dead Sea. This is the first in the series of Dead Sea videos we're going to do. There's 3 major sites here, and then of course the Dead Sea itself that we're going to be talking about. This is the first of the 3 sites that we're going to today, and of course we came here in the morning because this place can be brutal in the midday sun. So this is actually a palace behind me. If you can see, there's a giant mountain. There's a huge mountain range that kind of goes across this entire area here. We are right now in the lowest place on earth at the Dead Sea, and these mountains kind of surround it all over the place. Now, we've talked previously in this series about Herod the Great and how he's a master builder. This is one of the major projects that he took on. And basically, he took the top of a mountain, chopped it off, and created this large living space and palace up here on Masada. So we're going to talk about that today, but there's also a really kind of horrifying story that actually happens here right after the death and resurrection of Christ. This is actually where the last stand of the Zealots took place, the Sicarii. Let's go up here. We're not gonna walk it up. There is like a mile trail that you can take that's like super vertical and kind of scary at times. We don't have time or energy to do that today, so we are gonna take the cable car. So let's go ahead and do that, and we'll meet you up there. While it may not look like it, I am on top of a mountain right now. You have 3 main ways in order to get up to Masada. One is the snake path. This is a little over a mile-long path that goes basically straight up the side of the mountain, kind of zigzagging back and forth and up a ton of stairs. You could also take the cable car, which costs a little bit of money, but is well worth it if you're carrying a lot of gear like I am today. And then there's a third way that you can take coming up the opposite side of the mountain range, up a ramp that we'll talk about in just a second. That's really important to this place, Masada. Now just imagine what it took to actually build this place. I'll try to find some drone footage online since I can't fly a drone here, and I'll show you exactly what this place looks like from above, but man, is it impressive. Herod the Great basically chopped off the top of this mountain, made whatever he wanted here. There's 2 different palaces, a bunch of different buildings. This building that's behind me is one of the smallest ones that's actually here. So we'll check out some of the other things that are here that are really important to Masada in general. Basically, this place was made to be the best fortress ever. It's a huge mountain that you could see all around you in every single angle, and there's no good way up here and no quick way up here especially. So it would be very difficult for anybody to sneak up on you and to get up here without you knowing. And so this made it super defendable and easy for King Herod to know what's going on. This place was basically made to take on a long siege, which is exactly what happens here in about 73 AD. Overall, this place is really amazing. Not only the buildings that were constructed here, but also the systems that are in place to keep this a viable place to actually live. There are storehouses and even ways in which water was collected on top of the mountain in the middle of the desert, where the only body of water is the Dead Sea over here, with obviously no potable water there. And so what they actually had here was a huge rain collection system and large cisterns in order to house all of this water for a long time. That was really important, especially for people that were up here either patrolling or later on, as we talked about, the Zealots who actually did their last stand here. And now let's get into that story. So obviously Herod the Great wasn't around forever. He did eventually die even before Jesus' ministry. Then after Jesus' ministry, there was a lot of different things that happened, including a Jewish-Roman war around 66 AD. And then past that, basically this place was left abandoned.
Because Herod's forces obviously were no longer here, then the Romans didn't really have a use for this space, and so the Zealots saw that it was abandoned and actually took up this large fortress as their own. And so for several years, the Zealots actually lived here. They used the storehouses, they used the cisterns, and they were able to basically defend this location. Now, of course, Rome has been wanting to get rid of the Zealots for as long as they existed, right? These are assassins, and specifically the group that was here, a lot of people believe that this was the last remnants of the Sicarii. Sicarii referencing a dagger, a kind of curved dagger that these assassins would use in their work. And we actually see an example of this in the Chosen in Simon the Zealot, as he's a part of the Sicarii order.
Show me your weapon. Impressive. That is something.
Without my secret dagger, why do you need someone like me?
I have everything I need. But I wanted you.
And since the Romans really needed to get rid of the Zealots, they decided to siege Masada, and that was around 66 AD. The Zealots took this place, and then immediately the Romans began to kind of plan what they were going to do. Now, this became such a big battle that the Romans actually started creating camps all around Masada. This was because they needed a place to live and eat and sleep, because it was taking them literal years to siege this place. And so it took forever. But there was one thing that the Romans did know, and that was that eventually they would win. Because, of course, Masada doesn't really have any great farmland, doesn't have a lot of good, useful things to keep you alive for many, many, many years, right? Eventually, you're going to run out of stores. Eventually, you're going to run out of water. Eventually, you're going to run out of time. And that's basically exactly what happened here at Masada. The Romans waited, and they spent their time kind of sieging this area and cutting off their water supplies, cutting off their food supplies, and making sure that their time was running out. Near the end, the Romans began to build a giant ramp over here on the other side of Masada. And this is the ramp that they eventually brought their siege tanks up and broke down the doors of the fortress and came into Masada. And so the next question is, well, did the Romans win once they got in here? What was the battle like? What was the fight like? And so the story actually goes like this. Some people believe this is a myth. Some people believe this is not true, but some people believe this is definitely exactly what happened. But the only real evidence that we have of this story is from Josephus, who is a historian right after the time of Jesus. Now, he mentions things about Jesus, he mentions things about Masada, he mentions things about a lot of different things, but he has a tendency to over-exaggerate and maybe to tell stories from time to time, although some of his writings are definitely credible, and it's hard to say which is which, so take this with a grain of salt. But here's the story that Josephus actually tells us about the Zealots at Masada. So slowly but surely, the Romans begin to build this ramp on the other side of Masada, and they're bringing their tanks up, and they burst open the doors ready to fight the Zealots. But that doesn't actually happen. You see, the days upcoming to this big battle, the Zealots saw that the ramp was coming. They saw that all of this was happening, and they knew their time was up. There was no way they could escape. There was encampments all around Masada. There was nowhere for them to run. And so what they decided to do was to keep their dignity, to keep their honor. They decided basically to kill their families and then themselves. If this story is true from Josephus, it's one of the saddest in all of Israel's history. I mean, imagine having about 960 to 1,000 zealots up here on this mountain all by themselves, knowing that they're about to lose a battle. But what they decide to do in taking their own lives is have a very organized way of doing so. This is because suicide is so looked down upon and can have major ramifications within religious beliefs. And so the zealots didn't want to commit suicide. What they did was they had a highly organized plan to take everyone's life. They picked 10 of the zealots to be the main culprits of this matter. They killed literally everybody else. Then with those 10 left, they actually drew lots to have one person kill the rest of the 9. And then that one person was left to do the job himself. So that means whenever the Romans had come up on Masada, there really wasn't anything here. The food stores were probably empty, the water was probably gone, and the zealots were out of time. There really wasn't anything to see but bodies on the ground. And that's basically where Masada stopped. There wasn't really anything else since then
until now. There is some evidence that the Romans would have used this fortress after that siege, and then also later on the Byzantines would have come here and built some smaller buildings as well, but nothing to the size of what Herod built here. Definitely not. But as you can see, there are a ton of people that actually come to this place and tour it, not only from outside of Israel, but actually a lot of people from Israel come here for school trips or different things like that as well. So both a majestic palace and a grim graveyard, Masada is one of the most interesting places in the Dead Sea. Welcome to part 2 of the Dead Sea section of our Israel series. This place right here and the people group that lived here are probably way more important to your faith than you even realize. And while they don't have necessary ties to early Christianity or to even what we do nowadays in our religion, they do have a huge part in showing us the authenticity of what is actually going on in Christianity, and that is massive. So where are we? Well, right now we're on the most northwestern side of the Dead Sea in an area called Qumran, and this place specifically housed a people group called the Essenes. Now, you might have heard of that name before, and that's because it's a sect of Judaism during the time of Jesus. You might have heard of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots, and this is another sect of Judaism here in Israel. There was a lot of them during the time of Jesus, but those are the really 4 main ones that kind of stood out above the rest. The Essenes overall had a very particular way of going about life. For example, their ritual bathing. This was a thing that they would do all the time, even more so than maybe some of the other Jews in major cities like Jerusalem nearby. This was very specific to them because of the work that they did here as scribes and different ways that they operated as a community. Now, speaking of community, overall, the community aspect of the Essenes was huge. They shared everything. They were all one big family. And of course, this was a major operation here in Qumran where all the Essenes were together. And what are you going to do? You're not going to go off by yourself into the desert and go find your own stuff or hide your own stuff. Of course, you need to stick together in order to survive here, period. But getting to the most important piece of who the Essenes were is that they were scribes. They wrote down the books of the Bible. And this is massive for us. How do we know that they're scribes? Well, because we found their work. And this is probably one of the most important things that has ever been found for the Christian faith and for the Jewish faith. As you walk around Qumran, you can see several different rooms where people would have slept. You also see scribe rooms, and especially you'll see mikvah as well. These are the ritual cleansing baths that they would use in order to go cleanse themselves, go write some more scripture, go cleanse themselves, go write some more scripture. This is a very important kind of practice that they did over and over and over again. You may have also heard that there's a possibility that the Essenes have a connection to John the Baptist or to even Jesus. Now, we don't really know anything, and there's no evidence to prove this at all. However, John was kind of a nomad in the desert, right? He had this wild hair and he ate bugs, and he was just a different kind of guy. Part of that could be coming from the Essene lifestyle, or it could be showing that some of the beliefs that he has came from the Essenes, or at least were inspired by it, right? And so that's what some people argue, although we have no evidence for that whatsoever. It does seem kind of like John to be in a community like this, though, at least maybe for a little while. You see, the thing that really makes this place extra special is that the Essenes weren't just scribes of random things, but they were scribes of the Holy Scriptures. And of course, that means the Old Testament. So in the 40s, there was actually a shepherd boy that was walking right here near this cave. And as he was walking, he threw rocks into some caves nearby. And when he threw a rock into this cave, he heard something shatter. That was a tell, obviously, that he needed to check it out, and he did. And he found dozens of scrolls, ancient scrolls that were in pottery, and that was the shattering sound that he heard. So pretty quickly, archaeologists and other professionals came out here to see exactly what was happening. And of course, they looked through all the scrolls, and they see that these scrolls are all the books of the Old Testament except for Esther, at least pieces of them. Some of them are fragments, some of them are really almost entirely intact. For example, the Isaiah scroll, known as the Great Isaiah scroll, because it is the most intact version of this scroll that we have ever found. And keep in mind, the Essenes were here over 2,000 years ago, and these scrolls were dated back to the time before Jesus. Now, having all these fragments of these scriptures is important enough, and it's really amazing, but to have the Great Isaiah scroll, it just blows us out of the water for Christianity. Let me read you this excerpt from Isaiah 53.
Isaiah 53 is part of the Old Testament, but this specific chapter is a messianic chapter. That means that it's talking about Jesus. And I don't even have to tell you that in order for you to understand this once I read through this section here. Starting in verse 5, it says, "But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed." There are so many points in this chapter that point directly to Christ without a doubt. Even when Jewish people are shown this scripture today, they accuse Christians of changing the scripture after the fact later on in more modern history. But these scrolls being found here before the time of Christ, before any of that happened, before he died on the cross, before he lived in Israel, all of it, this shows us the authenticity of the scripture. It changes everything for us.
So just take a second and think about how amazing both this cave and this community of Essenes are. God used the last 2,000 years to house scripture for us right here. And just a little under 100 years ago, they were found. And that's within our time, right? Like, that's in our time frame, our generations here, learning more and more about the authenticity of scripture to bring more and more people to him. I love that he did this during my time. These are the type of things that oftentimes I find myself looking for authenticity and ways to verify certain scriptures, right? I want to be able to stand on a firm foundation, and that's what God has provided for us. We don't need this evidence, but it does certainly show us something. And so I love Qumran for that one fact. So this is the last of our 3 major videos in the Dead Sea area. This is Gedi, and this is gonna be a little bit of a smaller video today, but it's one of my favorite locations. Not only because it's beautiful here, it has amazing hiking and waterfalls, but obviously it's still popular even to this day for a reason. This is an oasis in the desert. There's a stream that flows all the way from the top of this valley all the way down. And this is a place that several people would have stayed during their time in the desert. And it would have saved their lives, essentially. One character in particular that is the most famous that stayed here is David. David was actually here with his mighty men as Saul was chasing him through the wilderness. Trust me, I understand how hard it is to be in the desert. Right now it's about 100 degrees in April in Israel. And the Dead Sea is the lowest place on earth, meaning it's one of the hottest places on earth as well. It's like Death Valley out here. But this oasis makes it worth it for people to come and to swim and to cool off in this area here. It's very popular today. There are probably several hundred, maybe even 1,000 people in the park right now. But for us, me and Vanessa are pretty much dying right now. So real quick, as we show you the rest of the park, let me show you this scripture about David and what he did here in En-Gedi.
In 1 Samuel, we see as Saul is actually chasing after David, as he believes that he's trying to overthrow him as the king of Israel. And so in chapter 24, we see the beginning of this and the confrontation between David and Saul here in En-Gedi. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all of Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave, and the men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord has said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you." Then David arose and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's robe, and afterwards David's heart struck him, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words, and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave, and called after Saul, "My Lord and my King." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men, who say, Behold, David seeks you harm? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hand in the cave, and some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand." As soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I repaid you evil. And you have declared this day, you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with your good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me therefore by the Lord that you will not cut off my offspring after me, that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold.
So does that story make any more sense now? I mean, you can see all the caves all around this area. There would have been ample places to hide, as well as food and drink, as there's tons of animals here and the water is constantly flowing. This oasis would have been a lifeline for David and his mighty men as they sat around the campfire talking about what their next move was going to be. Now, can you imagine being David and seeing your enemy Saul in this area, in the middle of the wilderness where nobody would know what would happen to Saul? But David honored God's anointing on Saul and didn't want anything bad to happen to him. Even after Saul's death at the hands of someone else, David goes and avenges those people because he is so honorable to that commitment to God's anointed. If you ever get a chance, I really suggest you come to Gedi. There's beautiful wildlife, a ton of waterfalls here, as well as many streams that you can swim in to have a lot of fun here with your group. Gedi is amazing. One of the most beautiful pieces in the middle of a dense desert. So cool.
Leaving the Dead Sea area, we make our way towards Jerusalem for the last leg of this trip. The drive is beautiful, leaving the desert mountains to this suburban wonderland that is Jerusalem. As you head through this tunnel, you can see to the left the majestic city as you emerge. It's one of my favorite views as you get here in the bus. You can't really see it too much in the car, but here we go into our journey into Jerusalem.
Welcome to the Jerusalem part of our Israel series. Here we're going to be talking about a lot of different places that are really important for the past, present, and future. This is an incredibly important location, and I think this is one of the best vantage points. This video is all about the Mount of Olives and what is going to happen here, what has happened here, and the importance of this very spot. You see, Jerusalem kind of works like this. You have the Mount of Olives to the east. If you go even further than that, you have Bethany, but then you have the Qumran Valley, which separates you from the main city of Jerusalem on this other ridge right behind me. Now, behind me, you're seeing several things that are incredibly important for three major faiths: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. These things are massive, like the most important things. Well, in Islam, it may be the third most important thing, but definitely for Judaism and Christianity, this location behind me is the most important. Off to my right, you can see the city of David. This is where David originally began the city of Jerusalem before expanding it to where it is now, obviously. Closer, right behind me, you can actually see the Temple Mount and the southern steps. But there's a huge event that could have actually happened here, including definitely Jesus going in and out of the temple from those very steps. Behind me, you can see one of the most contentious areas in all of Israel, and that is the Temple Mount. At least that's what we would call it. In Islam, this is another holy place that they have the Dome of the Rock and another mosque on the other side. I believe it's called Al-Aqsa. Now, we call this the Temple Mount because this is where we believe the second temple would have stood. It definitely makes sense in terms of how Herod built this Temple Mount here, and we don't know the exact location, but most people believe that where the Dome of the Rock is, that is where the second temple once stood. But we most likely will not be able to go up on the Temple Mount because this month is the month of Ramadan, and so it's been closed down to the public and tourists for now. Now, in this video, you may be asking, okay, well, if Israel controls this whole area, why is there a mosque in the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount? Well, this is a major point of tension for this area overall. And that is because whenever Israel basically took back over this land in the 40s and they were able to have control and actually make Israel a nation to the modern world, then they had everything in this area, and they even had the right to keep the Temple Mount. However, they decided to give it to Islam, and that is because they wanted to keep the peace between the area. This is one of the locations that they wanted most out of anything. You have to understand, the Jewish people, they know that this is the most holy location, because if this is where the second temple was, that's where the Holy of Holies would have stood. And that means that the Ark of the Covenant would have been there, which means the very presence of God would have been there as well. So as the Israeli people gave this to the Muslims, this allowed them to keep the peace in the area without starting any more conflicts over and over again. Now, this does help a little bit, but of course there's a ton of other stuff that always pops up from time to time. Now, the area where we're standing overall is the Mount of Olives. What else is on the Mount of Olives? Far to my left side over here is the Garden of Gethsemane. There's actually a church planted there in order to remember the time that the disciples and Jesus spent in that garden right before he was betrayed. This is an incredibly important spot, and there are even some olive trees over there from the grove that are over 2,000 years old. It really blows my mind that a lot of these things have stayed intact over the years, even with all the earthquakes, wars, and tension that goes through this area. Then over to my left side, right over here, is one of the most important locations for all of Christianity. And I cannot state this enough. Where we are right now is going to be a major, major location in the end times. You see that little area over there? Well, these are actually the eastern gates into the city of Jerusalem and onto the Temple Mount. This is incredibly important because, of course, this is where Jesus will return. In our scriptures, we hear that he is going to return from the Mount of Olives and go into the eastern gate. This is the exact route that he took right before Holy Week, going into the temple and before he was crucified. So it's incredibly important that we're here right now. There's so many things in this area that play into the biblical story and into the future of what we should be expecting. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is the eastern gate closed? And that's a very important question. Let's talk about the landscape that we're seeing right here. First off, I'm on the edge of a Jewish graveyard. There are thousands of Jews that are buried right here. These are normally very important people or people that have planned to have been buried here for a long time. Now, on the other side, closer to the wall, I believe that's a Muslim cemetery, and they own that portion of the mount over there. Of course, they own the top of the mount as well, and they are the ones who actually closed up those doors. Why do you think that is? Well, maybe it's to quell some of the enthusiasm that we would have as Christians. And of course, the beliefs of the end times for all three religions are vastly different. Now, the Jews believe in a resurrection, so they are buried here to be the first to be here resurrected in this place. But I really wanted to show you this location because it's so important to understanding everything here in Israel. But all across the horizon, there are so many important, incredible things here, either part of a biblical narrative or made by a biblical figure or a place where a biblical figure will come in the case of Christ. This is one of my favorite locations, just to sit and to look and to think about what has happened in this place here. It always blows my mind. Right here near the bottom of the Qumran Valley, heading into the Temple Mount, we have the Mount of Olives. And this specific place right here is what they deem to be the Garden of Gethsemane. While we don't know the exact location of where Jesus and the disciples were during that scene near the end of the Gospels, we do know that some of the trees behind me are actually about 2,000 years old. So they could have been either right after or right during the time of Jesus. And it's incredible to see that. Most of the things that we see that are that old are just the architecture or really old buildings or tombs or things like that. But having trees that are as old as the time of Jesus is really, really incredible. Now, of course, let me read you the scripture that goes along with the Garden of Gethsemane.
Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and he said to them, "Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand."
I think something that we miss when we talk about this scene from time to time is actually what Jesus is going through during this moment. It's not that he's necessarily super afraid of what's to come pain-wise. I think that he is as a human, but most of all, he's worried and he's scared of being separated from the Father. This has never happened before, right? And so this is a huge undertaking. This is something that he does not want to do, and yet he chooses to do the Father's will anyways. This is the perfect example for us of what to do in prayer, of what to do in our relationship with God. God, this may be what I want. This may be what I think that I need. However, whatever you will, that's what I want to be done. The Bible also talks about this in a different way in the book of James. It says, don't say we will do this and that tomorrow, or we will do such and such a thing, but actually say, if God wills it, we will do this and that. So don't plan in your own ways, but actually plan in the way of God. Very similarly, we shouldn't pray for everything that we want just because we want it, but we should ask God for his will in what we want. Now, in the same way, God is going to take your heart and your personality into consideration as well. There's a reason why he made you the way that he made you. Why would he give you skills in cooking if he didn't want you to use them? Why would he give you specific talents if he didn't want you to use them and be gifted in those things in order to glorify his kingdom? Of course, those things are going to become part of his design. But you have to think to yourself, what is God going to want? Not necessarily just what you want or what you think is necessary. And that's exactly what we see Jesus doing here. He's praying to the Father, saying, God, this is not what I want, but your will be done. May this cup pass from me, please. But even if not, your will be done, right? I'm still going to love you. I'm still going to follow you. I'm still going to be obedient because Christ was obedient perfectly, even to the point of death, even death on a cross. Now, in this location in Israel, it's really cool because they have part of this garden here with the 2,000-year-old trees. They also have a massive church right here, which is dedicated to that moment with Jesus praying in the garden. There's also, if your group can get it, a private tour over here where you can have a private garden to do different devotionals and different things like that. That's one of my favorite places just to have a moment and to sit in all the chaos of what Jerusalem is. That's an amazing, amazing place. If your group can book that private garden, I would definitely suggest it. So let me know in the comments down below, what do you think about the Garden of Gethsemane? Is this something that touches you as much as it touches me? I'd definitely love to know. Also, tell me about your prayers. What do you think about Jesus' prayer here? And how do you think about your own prayers?
I want to sit in the nook.
Welcome back to our Israel series, and today we're looking at one of my favorite sites. And you'll be surprised by this, but this is actually a sea site. This is most likely not the location in which what they say happened here. And we're going to talk about this in kind of two parts here. This is one of the tombs which they kind of say is the tomb of Jesus. However, even the owners of this location would say that most likely this is probably not the place, although it is one of the candidates. And this place that I'm in right now is called the Garden Tomb. As you can see around me, there's a beautiful garden as well as wildlife, trees, and a first century tomb. Actually, a pre-first century tomb from the 8th or 7th century and then reused during the Roman times. So this is a pretty old tomb here, as well as some other archaeological finds on this small property. This property is one of the only properties that I know of that is actually owned by a Protestant organization, meaning that this is a non-denominational kind of Christian site here. There are a lot of sites that are owned by the Catholic Church or by different denominations within Catholicism, but this one here is owned by a non-denominational organization that takes care of this and is able to house different Christian groups that come here specifically. Now, this is one of the most amazing locations, even though it's not mega authentic, because it's just a great place to come and to worship. It's a great place to come and just to have a second to breathe during your tours, which you don't normally get. A lot of these locations are rushing you out. They're trying to push you through
through as fast as possible because there's so many people that are trying to see exactly what you're seeing. But here you can actually book a space just like the one I'm standing in right now, and you can be able to sit with your group, even have communion and have time to worship. Oftentimes I'll bring a guitar and we'll do some worship music while we're sitting here. It's really, really beautiful. This is also a great representation of what an early tomb could have looked like during the time of Jesus. Even if this isn't Jesus's tomb, it helps you to understand what the culture was like even back then. Now, this location is just outside of the old city of Jerusalem, so it would fit where a tomb could be for Jesus' time. That's why the person who found it, Charles Gordon, actually said that this could be the location for Jesus' tomb. Now, there's some issues with that, and there's definitely some better evidence at the other location that we're going to look at next. However, here, there is a rock formation that does look similarly to a skull. And of course, if you know, Jesus was crucified on a place called Golgotha, and that means place of the skull. And so that would kind of fit with what we're kind of seeing in the scriptures. So the person that found it in the 1800s, basically they determined, okay, this is the place of the skull. This is where Jesus' tomb was. There's a tomb here on the property. This must be where Jesus was buried. It does make sense in the fact that Jesus' tomb would have been right near where he was crucified, because they had to bury him very quickly because it was Passover and then night was coming where they couldn't do any work basically during this time. So overall, while this may not be the exact location for Jesus' burial, I definitely implore you to come here with your groups. It's a great time just to be able to sit and relax with everybody and be able to worship together. You can't really do that in a lot of the other locations that you're going to go to here in Israel, and especially in Jerusalem. Oftentimes on our trips, we kind of say it like this: the other location that we're going to go to has more evidence. It's probably the real location. However, this location has the soul of the place. It's the place where you want to sit and relax and just bathe in the Spirit of God. So I'll just leave you with some footage of this place so you can sit, relax, and worship for a second as we look at this tomb and everything else in this area.
So now let's talk about the more likely location of the place where Jesus was actually buried. I'll be honest here, we were in a big rush and we could not be here for very long. So I'm going to show you some of the interesting parts of this, and I'm going to explain in voiceover the rest of it here, including why this ladder cannot be moved. So welcome, my friend, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In many ways, this is kind of the point of points for Christians coming to visit Israel. However, it's also one of my least favorite places to go. You see, this church, while it's amazing and the history behind it could be directly linked to the gravesite of Jesus, the tomb of Jesus, there's a lot to this place that is just not really fun to be. This location is controlled by several different church factions, 6 different organizations that kind of control pieces of this, and they've been fighting over it for a long time. Nothing in this place can be changed without the express agreement of all 6 of those organizations, which, to be honest, doesn't often happen. So much so that even the ladder that's on the outside of this building that I mentioned earlier is stuck there because someone put it there at one point for a restoration, and now they cannot agree whether to take it down or not. Yes, it's that serious. So there's a lot of different things in here that, of course, as a Protestant, I'm uncomfortable with, and that's just my personal bias. There is a ton of iconography, which of course is not normal for me, as well as gold ornate inlays everywhere and these massive different things that are just worshipped. I mean, that's what it really truly feels like when I'm here. Now, there are certain things in this area that are just amazing. For example, this room that you're looking at right now, it's showing you what they believe to be the bottom of the hill of Golgotha.
the place where Jesus was killed. Right here is another area where they have it revealed so that people can see the bottom of this hill as well. Now, at the very top of this hill, they have a place where they believe the cross was placed into this hill, but again, it's kind of hard to say if that's 100% accurate or not. The more secure evidence that we see in this location is actually the tomb of Jesus, so let's head that way. So now you're seeing the tomb of Jesus. Now, of course, it wasn't this ornate building. There's actually what they believe to be a cave hidden underneath this building, essentially. They built this around it, and obviously this whole entire structure, the church and everything, was built around this tomb. The tomb itself is a first century Jewish tomb that we know was used during the time of Jesus, and so that definitely fits with it. The more compelling evidence is the stuff that was built on this location after the time of Jesus. This location was venerated as a place where people went and worshiped Jesus, and the Christian faith began to sprung forth. People would come and visit this tomb quite often, even after the first century area and beyond. And then eventually there was actually a pagan temple built above this location specifically for the point of stopping Christians coming here. It's a pretty good point, actually, that makes this a legitimate spot. But actually, my favorite part of this location is somewhere that nobody goes. You see, behind the tomb of Jesus, is what they say that it is another first century tomb that is often completely empty. This is an exact tomb of what would have been seen during the first century. You can see these holes where the bodies would have laid and decayed, and then they would have collected the bones from them and placed them in ossuaries. This is a first century tomb. I mean, it is the real deal. And it's such a great example of what you should expect to see.
Right now we're standing in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This area is really, really interesting because there's a lot of evidence that within this area is where Jesus' tomb would have been, where he would have raised. There's a lot of things that happen in this area around Easter. Wish we were here for that, but we weren't. We're a little bit too late. This room here is a room that not many people come, and it's behind the big tomb up front that's really ornate and everything. If you come around here, you can actually see the entrance to a first century tomb right here. It's very possible that this tomb, or the tomb that they have out here, is the tomb of Jesus. If you come here, make sure you go behind the tomb and come here, and then go into this tomb over here, because this is a super accurate image of what you could have seen basically during the time of Jesus, and totally intact without having any ornate things or anything else there. So it's really, really cool.
So like I said earlier, we were not able to spend a ton of time there at the Church of Holy Sepulchre. If you want to learn more about the church, and I guarantee that there's some great videos out there on YouTube, go to Expedition Bible. He has one of my favorite videos on this location, and you can learn a lot more there and understand exactly what I was talking about in terms of some of the evidences that go along with that. But anyway, we had to go meet a friend for lunch, one of our guides that we love on our tours. And of course, she's just an amazing person overall, Pilar. And then we're going to head to our next location. So here we go.
Is this it?
Yep.
Oh.
Today we're looking at one of the most famous sites in terms of Jesus' miracles. Behind me, right here, you're looking at the pool, or more accurately, pools of Bethesda. This is where Jesus healed the man who was paralyzed for 38 years, sitting at this pool waiting to be healed. Now, originally these pools were actually made as reservoirs back before Christ was even born. But as you can see behind me, there are several layers to this puzzle here. When you come here, it's actually pretty hard to understand exactly what period you're looking at, which is why we need to talk about the different time periods, different eras that actually stood here at this place. Now, as far as we know, these were originally made around 2 BC as part of a giant pool structure, a giant reservoir, either for people to come and swim or to do different things or to house water itself. But by the time we get to the time of Jesus, these had become pools where people assembled to try to be healed, as we can hear in the story in the scriptures. As the Chosen references, this may have once been pools dedicated to the god Asclepius, and here people would seek healing from that god. However, in the Bible, depending on what version you're reading, either an angel came down and touched the waters, or the waters would rise up and people would run in to try to be healed whenever that happened. A lot of people believe that was a natural spring or a geyser or something to that effect that was happening here in these pools. Now, to give you a layout overall, what you're looking at on the left side is a portion of the left pool. Over to the right is going to be the rest of the pool over there. And a lot of this is still underground and cannot be excavated because of modern housing and different things are on top of it, including other archaeological things that have happened after Jesus' time. Although we can see that the left pool is very, very deep, and it even spans way further off to the left side there. And as you can see those main structures in front of us, you can see Byzantine and Crusader remains from this spot here, all dedicated to this being the Pool of Bethesda. Obviously a major site here and one of Jesus' most well-known miracles. Now, of course, this miracle here was very fundamental to Jesus' ministry. He got in a lot of trouble for healing this man on Shabbat and also having this man carry his mat and everything else that happened there. In The Chosen, this is a beautiful scene, and obviously we followed that in the past. But here, you can really see how so many people could have been gathered here in these different areas. Now, we know that this is the Pool of Bethesda because of the 5 colonnades that are mentioned in the Gospels. And here, we see that exact thing. Now, a lot of them, again, like I said, are underground, but we definitely have evidence of the outline here of the Pool of Bethesda, which would have been outside the city previously in Jesus' time. Also on this site now is a church called St. Anne's Basilica, or St. Anne's Church, and this is a church that actually has a long varied history, being used for different purposes and I believe by different religions as well. But now is a basilica. It's St. Anne's Church right here, and it's very, very well known for its acoustics inside. Here's a short clip of that. Welcome to St. Anne's Church. This church is well known for its acoustics, so let me just sing for you real quick. And you are Jireh, you are enough. And you are Jireh, and you are enough. And I will be content in every circumstance. And you are Jireh, and you are enough. Forever enough, always enough. You are more than enough. Forever enough, always enough. You are more than enough. To me, this is one of the coolest of many places that Jesus did his miracles here in Israel. And it's cool that you can still see all the layers of architecture and different things that happened here over the many, many years, all the way back to the original pool right behind me.
Clothes here instead.
Welcome to our first site at what we would call the Temple Mount. This is, of course, the Western Wall. You may have heard it referred to as the Wailing Wall, and that is because Jewish people will come here to wail, because this is the closest location to where the Holy of Holies was said to be from the Second Temple period during the time of Christ. Now, of course, the Second Temple was completely destroyed after 70 AD, and the Romans came in and destroyed everything, then several earthquakes after that. A ton of stuff happened after the death and resurrection of Christ that completely changed the landscape of this area. However, the Temple Mount is still behind me, and the same walls that were here during the time of Jesus are still intact, at least at this portion. That's why the Western Wall is so important. Let me kind of zoom out and show you the map of the area and tell you exactly what's going on around the Temple Mount here. Obviously today there are even more people than I would have expected actually here. This is during the celebration of Ramadan, and so I think because of that there are extra security measures and kind of shows of force that are kind of going on in this area here that I wasn't even expecting personally because I've never been here during this time. However, the Western Wall itself seems to be pretty clear, so we'll go up there in a little bit and show you exactly what that's about. Basically what people do when they come here is they pray at the wall. They want to be close as they can to God because remember, the Holy of Holies would have housed the Ark of the Covenant, and in other words, the presence of God. And so that's why it's so important for these people to get as close as possible. You'll see a lot of Orthodox and other types of Jews that will come down to this place to pray at this wall because it's very, very important. If I can, I'll get you a little bit of footage of the left side of the wall where people actually will go in and study and pray and actually work on their rabbinic studies, basically. This is only for the men. There's a little section for the women, but you kind of have to go all the way around and find a different way in. The women's side is the right side right over here of this whole wall on this section. The main reason for that is because the more northern that you go on this wall specifically is the closer to the actual location of where the Holy of Holies was, or at least that's where they believe it was. Now, I've never been up on the Temple Mount during all of my visits, and this time's no different. This time it's because of Ramadan. They've actually closed down the Temple Mount to all non-Muslims, so nobody can go up there that's not part of Islam. Obviously, this area is one of the most contentious out of anything that we've seen in Israel so far. We've got the Dome of the Rock, which is obviously massive in Islam. We have the Western Wall, which is the holiest place in Judaism. And of course, this place is really important to Christians as well, because this is the location where Christ will come back, right? This is the location where we believe the Second Temple was. This is the location where we believe the Holy of Holies was. So because of that, you'll often see a ton of security here, both from the Israel side and from the Muslim side. And so those both will kind of work together to make sure that this area is safe overall.
So luckily this only happened a couple times on the trip, but we are getting kicked out for filming here. I guess they just didn't like us setting up to film. They said we could film anything, we just couldn't be standing there with a microphone. I don't know, just weird stuff like that happens from time to time. But here is the men's section of the Western Wall. Obviously this is me filming here. You have to actually wear a head covering if you're here, no matter what denomination or anything else that you are. You will also see as the Orthodox Jews tend to walk out backwards from this area to give respect to it, facing it the entire time. So these two things, wearing a head covering and walking backwards out of here, are a sign of respect to this area. Because remember, this is the closest that you can get to the Holy of Holies. This main large wall in front of us, you'll see many people praying at it, as this is the main location where a lot of people will gather to pray. You'll also see plenty of papers on the ground or in the cracks of the wall in order to basically leave their prayers there as close as they can legally get to the temple. So you see that. Now in this location, this is normally only for the men over on this side, although I think there is a small location far to the back left over here that is for the women specifically to be in this area. Of course, this is the holiest location because it's even further to the north here, closer to the Temple Mount. Now, if you saw quickly there, there's also a large cabinet in front that has an imagery of the Second Temple on it, and that is where all the scrolls are held. There's lots of books and different things. Remember, the Orthodox Jewish men don't have jobs like normal people will. This is their job, to be a student of the law, a student of religion. And so this is their primary purpose here. This is the southernmost section of the Western Wall. This is the transition between Western Wall and Southern Wall, which both are very important to the Christian faith. Here you're going to see a lot of different things. For example, mikveh that are here. We're going to see a lot of those, as well as rubble. All of these large rocks are from the original construction on top of the Temple Mount. These are pieces of the temple, Solomon's portico, or the walls surrounding the Temple Mount. These are really incredible finds, but they've just been sitting here for a very long time. The group that currently owns the Temple Mount actually has done an illegal excavation and dumped a lot of material just in the Kidron Valley. So much so that you can actually go with your group to dig through these piles and to find artifacts from the Temple Mount itself. It's really incredible.
This section right behind me is the transition between the western side and the southern side. Now the southern side is actually really important as we have southern steps that lead up to the temple. And we're going to talk about those in a second. But first I want to talk about the western side. Of course, the western wall is incredibly important. Right here we have this little arch shape right here that actually used to come out of the wall as a staircase. And this is called Robinson's Arch. You might have heard it called the Herodian staircase as well. That's the staircase that would have come out of this side of the Temple Mount all the way down, and there would have been entrances up there as well to go up into the temple. Now this side of the Temple Mount is actually an archaeological park, which is really, really interesting. They have the southern steps and everything that happens over there. So let's go over on that side and go ahead and check out the southern steps. One of the things that I love about this park is they have the old next to the new. Of course, there's a lot of new pathways and new kind of built up areas around here showing the archaeology, but there's also the old where this originally was back in the day. This is an old staircase here that's been destroyed by earthquakes and different things falling on it over the years. But now we have the new staircase right here where people can walk down and see both sides. I really like how this is done, how they're not destroying all the old, but they're not completely kind of making it impossible to traverse either. They're allowing you the best of both worlds. So let's continue on this way. And if you're wondering what this is right above me, this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is one of the most holy places for Islam. And of course, that's up on the Temple Mount, which they control right now. So right behind me, you can see the southern steps. This area would have been where millions of Jews would come from all over the place for different feasts like Passover, come up these steps and be able to go to the Temple Mount. But before they do that, they would have to cleanse themselves. As we've talked about in previous videos, ritual cleansing is a massive, massive deal. And so here, there would be dozens, if not hundreds of mikveh ready for people to cleanse and be ready to go to these feasts. And to keep you oriented on the map, this is the southern side of the Temple Mount, hence the southern steps. And over here on the side of the frame is the Mount of Olives. So all of this is right next to each other. We were just up this hill a few videos ago. You can actually see the exact spot where we were. And just like I've been talking about from basically the beginning of this series, you can see that there's a mix here of reconstructed versus original. These steps that I'm sitting on right now are the original steps. The steps that not only the Jews would walk up, but also that Jesus actually taught at. Some of these steps Jesus could have walked on, most likely would have walked on as many times as he went to the temple throughout his life. He definitely would have come up these steps, and we see scripture that shows us that he taught here, that he was here. And this is a massive, massive thing. Now, with the southern steps straight to your back, you see this area behind me. And this is one of the major excavations that has happened at the southern steps. It's not just the steps that are important, but the things that are around them. As I said before, as millions of Jews are coming for these different feasts and different things that are happening on the Temple Mount, there would be hundreds and hundreds of mikveh all over the place. Not just on the southern side, but all around the temple, and even down to the Pool of Siloam, which unfortunately we're not probably going to be able to get to this trip, hopefully in another trip. But the Pool of Siloam would have been a massive, massive cleansing pool for hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of people to come and to cleanse before they came up to the temple. And that was straight down here. But all of these little holes that you're seeing here, all of these little locations are all mikveh on the Temple Mount right here, or right before the Temple Mount, I should say. And those would all lead up into the temple in order for the Jews to be cleansed ritually before going to sacrifice and obviously do all the things that they needed to do in the temple. Really, really important spot. But there's another story that could link to this location that always just completely blows my mind.
While we can't confirm it ourselves, there are some people that believe this is actually where Pentecost happened. That yes, there was an upper room, but at some point they came to the temple, the house of the Lord. And actually this is where all the baptisms happened for Pentecost. This is why 3,000 people could be baptized on that day. Like I said, although we can't for sure say that this is the fact, it does seem to make a lot of sense that this or the Pool of Siloam or something nearby would be where these people were baptized if they were water baptized. But maybe that's another conversation for another day.
All right, so you may hear the Muslim call to prayer as it's Ramadan and it's about time for everybody to get up on the Temple Mount to pray tonight with them. But that means it's time for my outro here. Hopefully you've understood something new about this location and maybe even learned something, that this is a possible location for the area of Pentecost. That would be really, really interesting. So many mikveh, the perfect location, going up to the house of the Lord. I don't know, it could be, but it's not for me to say. Overall, I think this is one of the most amazing locations. I love being here, and I love showing people these southern steps. These steps definitely were somewhere that Jesus was, and not only Jesus, but many, many, many other biblical figures that would have come up and down here, including Paul, Peter, Andrew, Simon, everybody, right? All the people would have been here because this is the center point for all of Judaism, and so that was huge for them. All right, the cars are telling me it's time to go. Thank you guys so much for following along with our journey. We've got many more videos to come, so stick around, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace. If you've been loving our videos and you want to see more amazing locations like this in person, then make sure you check out Imagine Tours and Travels, ittworld.com. The link will be down in our description, and you can check out any of their trips they're doing all throughout the next few years. They've got trips to Greece or Germany, and of course, here to Israel. They've been doing this for a super long time, so they know exactly what they're doing. They wouldn't send you somewhere if it wasn't safe, and I promise you that Israel is a great place to come, even right now. Without Imagine, we definitely could not have done this trip overall. They helped us with logistics and a ton of other things things behind the scenes in order to make sure that we are safe and taken care of every single step of the way. So if you're looking for someone that you can trust in order to take you to Israel, Imagine Tours and Travels is your people. So go and check out their website and see what trips you'd like to go on. And you can even come with us if you'd like, and we're going to have a ton of fun. I was just talking to our guide in Jerusalem earlier today, and she is ready to go. So this is going to be a trip of a lifetime. Do not miss it. Sign up in the link in the description down below.